Welcome, Father. I'm very happy to talk to you and about this topic of what Rome means as a title, and probably we'll end up talking about church-state relations as well. So, does that sound good to you, Father?
Yes, no, it sounds good. I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah. All right. Oh well, let's start, I guess, talking about our kind of main topics, which will be, well, what does this thing, first Rome, second Rome, third Rome, what do people mean by that? And then inevitably we're going to be talking about church-state relations, I'm pretty sure. And I think that our conversation will be a fairly light historical overview. I haven't prepared much in terms of gritty historical analysis, so we'll be probably fairly general there, but hopefully we'll look at different periods in history to elucidate and elaborate what these terms mean and what church-state relations might have looked like in different places at different times. So Father, with your permission, shall we start? I guess first Rome. What's that? We'll say up to the year 330 before Constantinople was kind of officially started. So, would you like to say a few words to us, Father, please, about Rome, Christianity, empire in the first 3 centuries?
Yes, well, as far as I can. I'm not going to pretend to be a deep scholar or a historian on these matters, so forgive me if I make some little minor errors. But it is interesting to note that Rome was the imperial city. That's where the emperors were, or the head of a Roman Empire, which by the time of Christ has spread basically across around the Mediterranean Ocean, sea, I should say, up to Britain, not quite into Britain. It sort of nibbled a bit of Britain by the time of Christ. It was in the Middle East. It got taken over sort of Asia Minor, which is where modern-day Turkey, Greece, everything between that and right out to Spain and North Africa, Egypt had all come under Roman influence. And actually just before Christ, or at his birth, we get the movement from the Republic into the Empire. And so Augustus becomes the first emperor not far before Christ was born. So he's born in the Roman Empire, which as a republic had conquered these things. So, which is interesting. And there's a case here for, and then you see Paul call himself a Roman citizen. We're getting the whole thing about tax and whose coin it is, the whole relationship between Israel and the empire, because this is the first time we saw Israel has become under an empire without being carried away as prisoners by that empire.
Yeah.
At least not at the time of Christ. Later on, they again felt the wrath of empire.
Well, maybe later on that happened, a bit later, maybe a little bit.
But at the time of Christ, they were. So it was interesting issues because of Israel's sense of the chosen nation, the people of God, the ones who the Messiah will rule from them. How can they be subjected to the empire? To subject yourself to empire, surely it's a revolt against the God's law, etc. So the Jewish thing, this is why they're hoping for Christ to be this great ruler to come and save them as an earthly ruler, and then Christ is saying, "I'll give Caesar what is Caesar's." Well, what's going on?
So, Father, what I just did just now, a few minutes ago, was I recorded onto my channel a short 8-minute video of Blessed Theophylact's commentary on Romans 13 of the Apostle, which talked about Romans 13. So that's kind of on the topic that you've just mentioned in passing there. So that'll be a reference to our live stream.
Yes.
Sorry,
No,
carry on.
Yeah, yes. So okay. Um, so so it is an empire that spreads across, and what you get with the empire, of course, is all roads lead to Rome. Rome is the chief city of the empire, and you'll see that Paul appeals to the emperor. So he's playing on Roman law, and he's showing himself to respect the Roman law, just as Christ respects the coin. It says, look, whose picture's on this coin? Well, that belongs to Caesar. Give it to Caesar what is Caesar's. So we see Christ himself respecting that, which is probably it's got a scandal to the Jews because, but this is what the mystery of what he answered, the way he answered that they couldn't sort of argue against that, but it wasn't sort of trying to trip him up at that stage.
Yeah, well, it's a big trip up because apparently I understand that Caesar Augustus was simultaneously held the position as being the high priest of his own cult, well, of that cult, that Roman cult. He was a priest in his own religion, so that wouldn't go down too
well. He was
well.
almost a semi-demigod in his own religion. The empire sort of almost deified their emperors as a means of getting allegiance to the emperor, which of course was a big problem for the Christians. So you had, as you said, you have the imperial cult, where is a sacrifice to the emperor and in his deity sort of thing. And of course, yes. Now this brings up a very interesting point. So you get Christ himself saying, "Here's this coin is Caesar's, give it to Caesar," but at the same time, give to God what is God's. And so while and Romans 13, obey the rulers which are set up for you. Now, I think this is Theophylact describes all this as more the system of rulers rather than any specific ruler. That in other words, God has ordained that there should be governments and structures like that to prevent anarchy, and that these governments help to reinforce piety, to make sure that prisoners are put in jail, etc. So it's their job to do that. However, having said that, there is a certain level where we only obey those governments. So those structures are there, so we should obey the government. And one of the early Christian things is we pay our taxes. Now, it is proper to pay our taxes to the government, as Christ says. As Caesar's, give it back to Caesar what he wants from that. And so Christians are definitely not rebels against society. They are to follow the hierarchy, because these hierarchies are in general, and you see most governments are there to keep public order, etc. Otherwise, we go onto chaos. And this conforms with the Christian perspective that we have a sense of order from on high, even though we'll develop all these things later, have a sense of freedom and self-autonomy within that order. In other words, God doesn't control us. He exhorts us, etc. He keeps certain bounds on us, and he prescribes certain punishments as necessary to train us and teach us. But he doesn't try to control us directly. He doesn't make us be good. He doesn't set oppressive laws on us to guarantee every little detail sort of thing. He actually wants us to rule with him and to participate in him and to have a freedom within this, but just barriers to show where the limits of our freedom should be exercised. So yes, and so this is a sort of relationship which is good governance, where of course we should have some sort of structure which we have our civil relations in, and we should obey those. Otherwise, we're actually sort of going to a freedom apart from God, as if we rule ourselves in opposition or contrary to God, without having a sort of reference to God. So reference to the state is a respect to a reference to God, just as we have all hierarchical institutions are actually set in place to keep that dynamic between man and God realized through human relations.
So if I'm thinking about the martyrs of the first 3 centuries, they submitted to that imperial authority by allowing themselves to be martyred.
Well, yes, and then of course Yes, indeed. So they let themselves. They didn't fight. They didn't pull out swords and start fighting back. They accepted the chains and stuff and went off. I mean, Ignatius of Antioch went off gleefully to his martyrdom, knowing that it was a testimony to Christ and his glorification. So he was telling people, don't try to prevent me going or things in his letters. So they took that in a positive sense. Obviously, we are also have a natural fear of dying, as Christ himself didn't want to, when his death, blood is not sort of like we sort of run out like madmen to do that. So martyrdom is something we don't race towards there, but if it comes upon us, if the government takes us, well, we should go and accept it quite. We don't fight back. We just accept what has been there, but we don't race out to be martyred. But at the same time, there's a few exceptions, but generally if it comes to be, because we of our confession of faith, we are to be martyred, then we should take that. But so this is where the martyrdom comes, when they revolt against the imperial cult. And so the Romans thought, well, if you do this, you're revolting against the emperor. And the Christians said, well, no, we don't want to revolt against the emperor in his secular rule capacity. We'll pay your taxes. We'll be good, quiet citizens, get on with our lives, do our work, etc. Not interested in having rebellions or things. We'll take the government as it comes, whatever Caesar's in place. It's not us to judge that matter. But we won't offer this religious worship to the emperor. And so if that was forced, then they refuse, and then the emperor gives them the due punishment, which is usually martyrdom or some sort, for their refusal to do that. But we still follow God, and so there is martyrdom when the state demands us to do something contrary to our faith. And today we do the same. If we're asked to promote or do something which is contrary, or confess something or swear something which is contrary to our faith, we have to say no. We can't do that. That is not what we can do as Christians. We owe obedience to God first, and this is including things of, say, church worship. We owe worship to God. We owe worship God continually, as we were just saying before. We'd like to serve daily to a liturgy, but this continuous should be every Sunday. We should be going to offer, with the only exception of sort of tidal wave comes in and wipes out the church, or you get strained and you can't get, some physical thing. But if the government suddenly said, no, you're not allowed to go and worship on this day here because we're going to lock down the churches, we're going to prevent you going to worship. That's not your government's place. And so we go to...
Sorry, Father. Yeah, Father. So let's go back to the first 3 centuries and together try to form a picture of the church in Jerusalem and Antioch and Alexandria and Rome in those first 3 centuries, and the state in those first 3 centuries. And I'll say what my picture is, and you can add more detail. So, I mean, obviously Antioch and Jerusalem very early on, obviously Alexandria, great Christian centers, probably Rome, in my mind, Rome a little bit, Carthage, of course. I kind of have a sense that the churches were very local. The church was a very localized phenomenon for a lot of this time. What do you think?
Right. Okay. We're moving on to yes. Well, this is going to be multiple faceted in this. So, where do I start from this? So, just talk about ecclesiology. The local church is actually founded, and you see the apostles going through city by city. So in each city, you get the presbyters / bishops ordained city by city. And so in the early church, each diocese with a bishop is founded around the city. Now, I take that as being in a state that a city is a gathering of people into one place. And the church is a gathering of the people into one place. We gather into one place with a liturgy. So the city is a good symbolic thing where there's a suitable number of people. Now, why does the number matter? Well, in each place, the bishop is installed, not just the bishop, but the presbyters. So in each place, you have the bishop and the presbyters. So it's not just one man there, it is a number. And so for this structure to have sufficient people to fill these places, you need a reasonably large population zone for this. In a village where you could have a single presbyter, there's no need to have a bishop, because the bishop comes with the presbytery around him. He doesn't come by himself. Why is that? The mystery of that is the church is founded on Christ and the apostles. You see in Revelation, Christ sits on the throne. He's surrounded by the 12 thrones on the elders, or 24. I can't remember which one. But these are the apostles reigning with Christ. And so, because the church is founded on Christ and the apostles, in each place there is an establishment of Christ and the apostles. So instead of this sort of Christ and the apostles sort of rule all the world, rather than having this world structure, which would collapse back into something like Judaism, where you have a centralized single city, you must come to Jerusalem as the only city, one place on earth. The church becomes in every place, and the whole church is in every place, and that's represented by the bishop and the presbyters being ordained at each place. That's why Paul talks about the presbyters here, or he's talking about the synod. Now, Ignatius points out that the synod is not just presbyters, but the name is interchangeable between bishop and presbyters. They are, as priests, governors, and teachers, are all the same, but the bishop is singled out from the presbyters to unite them. And he is, in a sense, as Christ, so he has a special authority to ordain them. None of the presbyters do the ordinations, only the bishop. And us with that is consecrating of altars and blessing the chrism, which we use for when we receive to chrismation, because in the early church you will see the apostles laying on hands. And so the bishop becomes a center of unity. So these three things unify the liturgy, they unify the union of baptism of the Holy Spirit, and they unify the ordination of the presbytery. They're all one priesthood, the one thing. But they all have the same grace as priests, teachers, and governors, and they rule together under the bishop's thing. But so this is, Ignatius talks about this, is that Christ, the bishop is Christ, and the presbyters are the apostles gathered around him with the deacons. So it's this. Who are the sort of ministers, the Levites of the Old Testament. So what we see is a high priest as well from the Old Testament, with the priests.
Yeah. So Father, I'll just pause you there if you don't mind. So I think that you've illustrated and summed up what I was talking about, the local churches in centers like Jerusalem and in Antioch and in Carthage and in Alexandria. So I think it was really important that you did that. It was really important that we had an illustration of what a local church is. And would you agree with me? Like, I think that's the fullness of the church.
Yes, well, this is why St. Ignatius calls this the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church, the proper meaning of a Catholic Church, is the church in each place with its bishop and presbyter. That is a Catholic Church, because Christ is there present with the bishop, and that is the head. The Christ is the head of a church that is manifest at each place. So the whole church, which means what Catholic means, a whole, is in each place. And
Father, let's do some apologetics. Let's imagine that some non-Orthodox are describing to us, which I think wrongly, what they'll describe to what you and I are getting at here. They'd say, oh, that's decentralized, that's distributed. You've got a decentralized, distributed formation. You've got a horizontal structure instead of a vertical one. I'm not sure if that's a useful model, because if we've got the fullness of the church locally, that's the fullness of the church locally. Now, I think I don't know. I would grope towards a different illustrative model to describe it, rather than just decentralization, distribution, horizontal, not vertical. But What do you think?
These models have some sort of attachment, but I don't think they're useful in themselves. It goes a lot more deeper than this. So yes, we have now, in a sense, if we want to talk about a decentralization, for want of it, there is one church, one head of the church, which is Christ. There's one universe of all the saints. And so in each place, you have a material earthly manifestation of the entire church. So in a sense, you almost have the fullness of the saints are there. When we go to the liturgy, which is represented the liturgy with all the saints, the fullness of the church is even at each liturgy, even with each presbyter, technically the fullness of the church is there. But the
so our liturgies are not a multiple aggregation of thousands of liturgies around the world making up the liturgy. Each liturgy, like you said, is
so in each congregation, in a sense, all the angels and everything are present in each place. This is what we say, it's the fullness of the church. So Christ, the universal church, headed to Christ and all that, that is manifest in each place with Christ as the head. That's why you can't have what the Cyprian calls a bishop of bishops. So the bishop is and when I say, an important thing about the bishop, he's a singularity. What does that mean? It means he's a one person who ordains in the diocese. He is the one person who gives consent for others to serve. He's the one person who consecrates the altars. He's the one person who consecrates the myrrh. Now, in practice now in Orthodox churches, the patriarchs tend to do that. We'll go on to that. Technically, they shouldn't. It's actually the bishop's job, but for some reason they've done it, which is not wrong, but it just distorts things a little bit. And there's a singularity. So the key to this, because he's a point of singularity for union and to have, so that everything is one, there's one Eucharist, and there's one priesthood, there's one baptism in a sense. This is represented by the bishop's singularity of consent, singularity of doing things. Therefore, there can be no one else who can exercise that authority in that diocese, because it's a fullness of church, without denying the singularity of the bishop. This is why only the bishop can ordain in his diocese. No one else, no other bishop can come in and ordain. Now, he can if the bishop gives consent. That recognizes his singularity of consent, then the other one can do the action. That's fine. But the bishop, local bishop, is that. Now, I'll just jump into Roman practice in the 8th century, just to reinforce this liturgically. If you go to liturgy in Rome in the 8th century, the Pope formally did the fullness of the liturgy. If there was an assistant bishop or a presbyter served the liturgy in his diocese, they would serve it in a sort of a limited manner. They would not do everything that the Pope does, because they are not the local bishop. They're an assistant or something, the presbyter, and so their liturgical actions are less than that of the bishop. And you see this in Orthodox practice too. The presbyter doesn't act in exactly the same way as the bishop when he's serving. We don't go and do the incense around the altar during the Holy God. This is the bishop does this.
Right. So those bishops in the 7th, 8th century in Rome that might have been in Rome under the Pope, who is the Bishop of Rome, would have, like you say, just had a little ancillary role. But when those same bishops were back in their own diocese,
right. So when someone is there, they wouldn't serve it in exactly the same way. There's certain actions they wouldn't do. They were not allowed to do. The fullness of the actions was but that says a local bishop in his own diocese does exactly as the Pope does. Liturgically, every bishop has a fullness of it. The Pope doesn't do anything more as Pope in his liturgy than any other bishop does in his liturgy. So in that sense, all the bishops are liturgically equal. And so this is one of the key things, is a singularity, and nobody can exercise his role, which is ordination, and consecration altars only, and the consent for the presbyters to serve. That's only his role there. That doesn't mean that he is not subject to a synod above him in other matters, but as far as his role as bishop is for his diocese, he is a singularity. No other person can have that jurisdiction within his diocese. And so he is one and only. And it's a whole point of being one.
Father, I'll take you back to the first 3 centuries with that picture that you're describing. Obviously would pertain there in those first 3 centuries as well, with the local churches there. And do you think that the standard explanation is that just simply administratively, geographically, and politically, the local bishops were concentrated in the major urban centres of those regions, called the metropolises, metropolia, were just conveniently kind of hanging like just hanging off the Roman administrative structure. Like, that's the standard explanation, isn't it? And I can see how that might just be a no-brainer, that the churches locally would coordinate with each other along those communicative, administrative, societal rules.
Well, there's two issues where actually the apostles themselves instituted synods. Why? Well, there's 2 things. One, we need a means of ordaining new bishops. So the bishops have to have someone to ordain them. And the presbyters, there's some argument, maybe the presbyters did it, but generally the presbyters can't ordain. Right. So who ordains a new bishop? So the presbyters don't have the power of ordination. It has to be other bishops. And and which other bishops? And what is a bishop? How do we know? What do you mean by this? The key for the bishop is the diptychs. We recognize this church as a church. We recognize this bishop. And that's how we know that this is a Catholic church in our communion. So there's a way we have to recognize each other as churches. We have to be there. And this is done through the synods. And the synods, as a unanimous decision, not by votes, which you get in modern times, but a unanimous decision. Now, when I say unanimous, there's a couple of just been obstinate and just arguing for the sake of arguing. That doesn't count. But what we're not talking about is a vote of majority rules or 3/4. There's no mark. It's just basically unanimity, unless it's obvious. It's a couple of the bishops have just been obstinate and just fight for no good reason. However, there's no good reason. If they can produce a good reason, then you listen to them. It may be that 1 or 2 bishops may say, "Look, this guy, we've heard that this guy's a fornicator. Don't ordain him." It's not like, "Oh no, it's okay." So if that has a good reason, then they could prove the case, and then they should listen to them, obviously. So we're just talking about because I don't like him. He spat at me the other day. I've just got a grump with him. So some picky thing like this, which can happen, unfortunately, even for our beloved bishops. So this is actually apostolic. These synods are not accidental. They're apostolic. They're necessary to the life of the church. And they also, when there is a problems in the church between so we have arguments, we have fights where people say things wrong. There has to be a system where if I have a fallout with another priest and the bishop passes judgment on that, I have to have a right to appeal, because the bishop might be influenced. He might be mistaken in the law and the canons and stuff like that. He's made unfair judgment. So I have to have a place where I can appeal this judgment. Or if the presbyter has a fight with his bishop, and that's no good, that the bishop stands in judgment. Well, I'm right because I'm the bishop. You're going to be defrocked because you disagreed with me. No, the bishop's not some sort of tyrant who orders people around, because that goes against that. We rule the co-rule. So the bishop can't just sort of order things around and just do as he pleases. He has to act according to the canons, and he can't just sort of arbitrarily just dismiss people. So there has to be a means of checking these questions. Did he actually work according to the canons, or has he just been arbitrarily nasty or whatever, and he just doesn't like that guy?
So Father, I'm really pleased you brought this up. I hadn't thought about the synod thing. And as I hear you talk, if I'm thinking about these first 3 centuries, I can't imagine the church functioning without this synodality. Couldn't function.
No, it can't. And now what the apostles did was, well, we have, again, the sense of unity. You have to have one bishop who ordains the others, and the others with their consent. And anything that's done in a rule of the synod actually has to consider all the bishops. Why? Because each bishop is properly head of the Catholic Church in his place. So the synod cannot impose on any bishop a rule to do something without his consent. So nothing can be done in the diocese without his consent. So whenever there's a synodal decision, that is why it has to be unanimous, that all the bishops have to consent, because they can't force something on any of the diocese without the consent of the local bishop. So this is not a top-down rule. But there's still one metropolitan, one head bishop that unifies the synod, so that there is. He does the one ordination again, so you don't get one bishop going off and ordaining somebody and 2 or 3 bishops running off doing this without the bishops. You have chaos. So
Father, sorry to interrupt you. What I'd like to do is really delve into this question of synodality, and maybe talk about the different kinds of synods that might take shape. But for now, I'd like to kind of stay in the these first 300s.
I'm just sort of building into
right,
this third century thing. So
yeah.
So I'm just saying this. So you have the metropolitan, what we call the metropolitan. Why is a metropolitan? Right. So what the fathers did was, well, who's going to be the chief bishop? The holiest bishop? Well, who's going to decide who's the holiest bishop? Is it going to be random? Is it going to be? There's problems about how to decide this. So they said, well, actually, we've got a nice structure sitting here in the empire with these provinces, with the chief cities in the provinces, and we've got these other cities around. So we're ordaining according to cities. Well, why not say that the person in the biggest city of the region takes the role of metropolitan? So therefore, the one who's in the chief city takes a chief role, because all the communications will go there. They have the apparatus for the secular apparatus, which means that the church apparatus can work efficiently and effectively. So they mapped onto the imperial system the church system. Now, this is very important. If you read the canons carefully, the church is not bound to the state system. The church used it initially to set its own structure, but the church structure becomes its own structure and does not conform to a secular structure after that. It contains it, even if a secular structure changes, except where secular changes are so monumental that it's impossible for the church to maintain its structures. But nevertheless, the canons are quite clear that, so in other words, if there's another chief city raised up in the same province by the government, that gets a sort of honorary title only, but the power and authority remains in the first and initial one. It can't get replaced. So the church, in a sense, takes its own tradition and stabilizes that separate from the state. So while it's borrowed the state system, while it's used it to establish its own system, it's not slaved to the state system. And many people fail to understand this distinction. They think the church has to be completely separate from the state. No, the church is borrowing and using the state system for its own purposes, just as it's using cities that are secular cities to establish where its bishops go. Now, that doesn't mean there's not some exceptions to this outside the empire due to necessity. This is not an absolute rule in the sense, but it is a functional rule which the church takes and has a stability. Now, having said this role of metropolitans, what you got as well with the church is, well, you've got all these little regions, hundreds of these synods. How are we going to unify the synods with each other? There's got to be a way to stop them falling into things. Otherwise, well, they'll collapse into localities and localness, and you'll end up with different faiths and stuff. So the apostles also, following the things, set up what is called exarchs, which are what's called the Roman diocese, which is actually a huge thing. It just includes many provinces. And so you'd have about 10 provinces in an exarch. And then the bishop of that chief city would have the authority to hear appeals from the synod. So you'd have like a court of final appeal, like it'd be a Supreme Court. So you'd have the bishop and his synod and the presbyters would form like a first court of lay people. You can appeal to your metropolitan court, or if there's a problem with the presbyters, they would appeal to the metropolitan. And then if there's a problem with that, either directly the metropolitan with one of the bishops, or if people are unhappy with the first appeal, they can appeal to the exarch here. So it's a very important system, legal system, appeal system, so that we follow we live by the rule of law. We live under the canons. And this takes into account, we don't have just do what we want. We live according to the canons of the church. So there's order is maintained. So this is mapped on. Now, of the exarchs, there are 3 in particular which stand out above the others in the first 3 centuries. And this is Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. These are the 3 chief cities of the empire. The church order of them is the same as a civil order, just as all the other orders. So it borrowed the secular order from the church, from the empire, which makes sense. The first see, the chief see of a church should be the one that's most open to the world, because the church, also the bishops, have an interface with mission. They have an interface to the world. And this is where we'll go church-state relationships later. But it's the bishops that form that interface. So, and a public sphere, that's different from the interface all the faithful have with their neighbors, etc., and talking to them in private and things like this. But when it comes to the official statements of the church vis-a-vis the state, this is through the episcopacy. But more properly, the bishop, who is closest to where the emperor is. And so both that all roads lead to Rome. So the Church of Rome naturally takes as a suitable place to take a preeminence among all the churches, as everyone's looking at it. So it needs a sort of extra protection. It needs an extra strength because it is A, the interface of the emperor, and B, the one where people are watching and seeing. So when you say, oh, that's what's done in Rome, let's copy that. There's a habit of looking through the senior sees. So the Rome is, and also Alexandria and Antioch. Now, just going back a step further with this, when I talk about Christ and the apostles, what also we have is Peter and the apostles. And Peter is a leader. And you'll see that Peter is called the rock. Well, who is truly the rock is Christ. So in a sense, Peter stands in the place of Christ. Each of the apostles, in a sense, stands in the place of Christ, just as each bishop is in the place of Christ. But each presbyter, vis-a-vis his parish, is also in the place of Christ. So there's multiple representations in the sense of Christ. But Peter sort of stands out as almost the rock among the other apostles in a sense, as a sort of a singularity. So his singularity is the groundwork of the presbyters, who are all equal in the sense as presbyters, all apostles equal. One is pulled out, is singled out. So Peter being called the rock as well means that the bishop isn't Christ over the apostles as at a sort of another level completely above. He's got some greater, higher thing, and these are sort of his slaves, no, he is one among them who is singled out. So at the one, he is presenting Christ as a point of unity, but he's also, in the sense of Peter, he is one among the many as a single unifying them. So this is again to show the equality as well as a sort of the singularity and the preeminence in that. And so that's quite important. So in each diocese, that Peter, the bishop, sits in the chair of Peter. These are the presbyters. In each metropolis, the metropolitan sits in the chair of Peter, vis-a-vis his equals, the other bishops. The exarch in a sense of the metropolitans. He sits as a single point, and quite often exarchs would be ones who ordain the metropolitans, but the metropolitans would ordain their bishops. And this is quite important for later on. And then you've got, so Rome comes out. So because Rome is the first or highest ranking of all the sees, it is primarily the sense of Peter as the one that unifies all the other churches, a point of unity. So it's more specifically is the see of Peter. And Peter and Paul go to Rome to emphasize this. So it's because Rome is a capital city, it's a place of the emperor. The apostles chose Rome for being the see, the preeminent see, as is in the preeminent city, but also it's the imperial city, the ruler, the one that has a sort of jurisdiction over the whole world. So that preeminent position is because it is that see. And now the see is not subjected to the emperor. So once Rome takes its place, it stays in its place. Even when the empire left and Rome became a back city, the position of Rome remains. So you see even the 9th century, when Rome is basically a little backwater town, the Bishop of Rome is still the highest ranking bishop. This is what I was saying. The tradition doesn't just swing, which will come in when we talk about Third Rome. It will come out later. So it doesn't swing with the political changes. So some people think Orthodoxy just swings with political changes. No, it's borrowed the political thing, but it keeps itself in its own tradition. And the Peter and Paul didn't go to Rome because it happened to be on the Tiber River, and that something special about the Tiber River and a city on the Tiber River that makes it the special place. No, it's there because that's where the emperor was, and Paul was appealing to the emperor. So it's the imperial city. So this is quite important. And Alexandria was the second thing. Now, what's also important is not just Rome is a Petrine see. It's also Alexandria and Antioch. So Peter goes to Antioch for a number of years, and you'll still see the see of Antioch recognize itself as a Petrine see, the see of Peter, because Peter was there. And in Alexandria was also Petrine, not because Peter went, but his disciple Mark went there. And so Mark went there. Now, interestingly too, so I can keep going for ages. Paul also was in Antioch. Paul also was in Rome, and Mark was also the disciple of Paul. So in other words, it's not just Peter. His name is there because he's singled out, but it's Peter and Paul are the princes of the apostles. So it's a double-headed principality, lest we think it's just one that sort of ruled overall. Yeah, in a sense is one, but there's another that takes the rule there and who's principal of the apostles to the Gentiles. And this is interesting. Again, it just breaks down this sense of one man dominating everything. There's something, an equality that's shared by the two. And in this, again, when you talk about the three Patron sees, Gregory the Great, in the letter to the Bishop of Antioch, the Patriarch of Antioch, not Antioch, Alexandria, the Pope of Alexandria, to be more correct, says, I talk to you as one in the Petrine see. There is one see with three bishops in it, one Petrine see. The Petrine see is actually manifested through three. Why? Well, the Petrine is rock. So for the churches to be stable, we'd actually need a stable center. If we have that keep falling and stuff, the center of unity breaks, then because we need to converge to one see for unity, because otherwise we have fragment. It's what's happening in Orthodoxy now. Oh, I've got this, my church, and I got this church over here, and we lose connection to each other, and it collapses into ethnicity or empires versus empires. The political thing can dominate. So there is a need to converge. But if that one keeps falling into heresy and stuff, the churches are easily fragment. So there is a need for a sense of stability in the central sees, just so that the churches can keep a certain stability of practice. But no bishop is immune to heresy. No bishop is immune to fall. No see is immune to falling. So there's a triple see, so that while maintaining the freedom of bishops to be themselves and to fall into heresy, the three protect that the whole thing collapses. So any one of the three is the fullness of the Petrine seed. And so the church, as long as one of the three keeps strong, the church still stays with its center of unity. So this is a very good structure. So it allows the freedom and yet allows its picture. So this is why it's 1 and 3.
Yeah, so thank you, Father. I'll pause you there because I think you've just explained how unity in the church and the church administration can gel separately from state structures and state systems of organization. I think that's what I've just heard you outline.
Yeah. The church takes its structure, borrows the state, maps it onto the state for sort of symbolic reasons as well, and practical reasons. There's many reasons for this. To the testimony, and when we come to church-state relations, it's actually quite important too. So in the first stage, this is a structure. There is no ecumenical council during this stage because, very importantly, no bishop had authority. So when I talk about these hierarchical structures, right? So you've got the bishop and his thing. He's a singularity point. No one can interfere. The metropolitan is a singularity. Only he can ordain bishops in his province. No one else has any right to go in there. And you see St. Leo the Great saying, look, the exarch, stop trying to ordain bishops within that area. You have no right to do that. It's a metropolitan's rights. The exarchate is the appeal court in the sense of his one. So no one else should be interfering with his right of appeal in there. That's his job. And because and then you've got the 3 patriarchs of Citrine Sees, and they're all equal as the See of Peter. So what happens here is that there is no structure, and not all the exarchs were under patriarchs. So Alexandria is one exarchate. Carthage was another separate exarchate, which sometimes even called itself a patriarch. Then in Asia Minor and Turkey, you had Thracia, Asia, and Pontus were 3 exarchs with their exarchs. You had in Greece, you had one in Thessalonica was an exarch, and you had some in Gaul as another Leons or something like that, which are more than just metropolises. But Rome actually took about 5 or 6 exarchates under its patriarchal jurisdiction, and the exarch-patriarch relation we'll come to in a minute, but Alexandria just a single exarchate. And so each exarchate was basically a final court of appeal. So you see later in the canon, which we'll talk about later, that you could appeal to your exarch or Rome. But the exarch was a little bit more, in the case of Rome, substitute for Rome. And so the Roman, if the exarch was being a bit problematic, Rome would go, watch what you're doing there. So he had a little bit more things, but still you get this. So there is, and now the jurisdiction of a patriarch is only in his own patriarchate. And so as exarch, that was a sort of top level of that synodal gathering. And so the patriarchs had a special role, but they are still effectively, so there's no one who could call it, and importantly, because each one is a top, no other bishop could call a synod in his area. So only the metropolitan could call a synod in his metropolis. He's the only one who's got authority to do that. An exarch could call a wider one of his exarch, but no one else can interfere. So in the early church...
Let me make sure I understood you. So with the structure of exarchies, and multiple exarchies, someone might think that maybe correctly or incorrectly, if say the administrative ecclesiastical center that Rome was had half a dozen exarchies that did they report directly to it? Whereas there were other exarchies, we'll say Carthage or Antioch or Alexandria or elsewhere.
Of interest was Asia at this time, Asia, which is Ephesus. Then you've got Thracia, and Pontus, which will come in later. But these were basically independent of any of the patriarchates according to their authority to do anything in them.
Yeah. So this picture is not the one that there's one spider web that Rome is at the center of, and all of them are radiating at different distances from that center. Yeah.
Now, this is a key difference between Orthodox ecclesiology and Roman one. It's weird we're talking about this. What I have described, what I have done, is that Orthodox ecclesiology, we have a means, the hierarchy, a structure that unites each church is a Catholic church with its own specific authority within itself. It's a complete church. And these mechanisms of metropolitans, exarchs, and patriarchs are there to unite many churches. They don't form a single church. So this is in modern times we'll talk about Orthodox, saying we keep talking about this local church, where we slip to meaning Antioch or Russia. But we've got to be very careful. They're not top-down structures. They are structures uniting many churches. What the Roman thing is you've got one church of which each local diocese is a particular part of it. But you've got one church. So the Bishop of Rome is the bishop of all the church. He has authority to ordain anyone he likes anywhere. He has the authority of bishop to go around to any diocese and ordain anyone he likes there, because he is bishop of all. And this, as I had one of the debates, I said, what does it mean if he comes into a diocese and there's a disagreement between the local bishop and the Pope? Who does the presbyter follow when he asks? One says yes, you can do this. One says no. And the papists, of course, said the Pope. And I said, well, there you go. You've just destroyed the ecclesiology of what it means to be a bishop, because there's one voice and no one else can have that in there. You've denied the bishop to be the bishop. Yeah, but this is where there's a major difference. They talk about the one church and they talk about the bishop, the Pope, having a synod of all those presbyters. There was no such thing. There was metropolitan synods are the synod, as you get in Canon 34 of Apostolic. Then you have the exarchs who can call sort of metropolitans and a wider synod in the exarchate, but that's not the standard functioning synod. The standard functioning synod twice a year is the metropolitan synods, and that's it. That is the functional synods from day to day. Now, in Eastern practice, Orthodox practice now, that tends to shift it to a patriarchal synod doing the same thing. And this is one of the bad things is what happened in Greece, and they've called all bishops metropolitans. That was a huge problem, because in the Canon 28, the famous one, it's quite clear that the patriarch only ordains the metropolitans, but not the bishops. When you put all bishops as metropolitans, it's a power grab from the patriarch to ordain all the bishops, and you destroy the triple layer system. And this is actually very problematic for the proper discipline in the church. It is leading to sort of certain corruptions which shouldn't be in place. The Russia hasn't done that, thankfully, and Serbia voted against doing that, and which is quite important that they did. But this is actually really a big problem in the ecclesia since about a century ago when this happened. This is a major problem, and unfortunately, is not looks like being fixed at any time soon. So anyway, these synods are down here. So this idea of one bishop of all the this is not early church, and that's what I was saying. The Pope couldn't call all the bishops, and he had no authority to call a synod of all the bishops. Now, that's distinct from him having authority to write to everybody and go, hey, what are you doing in Antioch? What are you doing? He had, of course, he had a right to sort of challenge things. When it came to an ecumenical council, he had the first voice to declare the faith. And quite often his one voice was sufficient. The document was, generally like a Leo at Chalcedon, his one voice was set the central doctrine for there. Though there was an opposing idea, and it's Saint Euphemia, they put it at her, and she put Liz at the head. And she was basically determined which was right, or demonstrated which was right. Then at Ephesus, it was Celestine, but it was really Cyril who was the leader of of the theology at this ecumenical council. Although Celestine had his say, as his letter came in as well on the conclusion. And then there was the first ecumenical council was basically Athanasius still even a deacon at the time, of Alexandria had the leading voice. So the Pope generally had the leading voice, but didn't have the sole voice. And you see this even at the Council of Jerusalem in the Apostolic days. Peter spoke first. He gave his first. But one of the probably main voices was Paul coming in and speaking at the synod. And then they came to an agreement. But so, yes, of course, the Pope or the Bishop of Rome has the first voice because he's the first to see. And often that is sufficient to deal with the matter, as long as everyone double checks that he's actually speaking correctly. As you know, he's been rightly dividing the word of truth, because he can get it wrong, as one of the popes of the early times said. But anyway, in the first one, there was no ability to have an ecumenical council, because no bishop had the right to call all other bishops into council, into a synod. He only had his exarchal right to do that, even if he had rights to sort of write letters out and complain or hear appeals. So even in the early church, you could appeal to Rome. So if you're metropolitans, now one of the things is you could sometimes appeal to your exarch, or you could appeal directly to the patriarch of Rome as there. And again, I like this because it means that there's the same canon law, the same rules in every place and everything. But you recognize the proper authority of the exarch of your area. And so he's a final court of appeal. You appeal to him, or you appeal to Rome. But if you appeal to Rome, you're fine. His decision is no more binding, but it shows the same tradition, same faith.
So, Father, do you think we should go on to the first council, in that case, the ecumenical one called?
Yeah. We can now talk about it. So,
I'll just introduce it, if you don't mind, just kind of seal what we've just talked about. So, just to sum up what we've talked about, it seems like we've distinguished the ecclesiastical organization separately from the secular state organization, and in that case, the city of Rome, in an administrative sense, is definitely one thing, as the imperial seat. Whereas you've also, distinguished its preeminence, or however you want to describe it, in terms of its ecclesiastical structure. So when we talk about first Rome, I think probably those two senses have to be borne in mind and kept separate, and the limitations of those two senses just need to be just acknowledged and kept in mind. But before we talk about the first council, it struck me that when you said, Father, that the arch hierarchs could invite other arch hierarchs to a council, they didn't have the force majeure to impose this obligation on anyone. Yet it seemed like, would you say that the Emperor Constantine, he instigated that first council, 325, from his imperial authority? So I guess that was an invitation to his subjects that happened to be
more
bishops.
than an invitation. It's an order. It's an order. Right. And this is what was necessary for the council, because in a sense there needs to be an order to come in. So Metropolitan orders his bishops to the council, and if they don't come, they get told off and no end. But you're expected to come, because you all need to come to testify to things. And there's a sense of the order. I'm not sure exactly how to best say it, but the authority of the council is something where it needs to be somebody where they're ordered into it, so that it becomes tied up with its authority. If they just come freely and stuff like that, there's something missing in its ability to truly represent the opinions of a church. It's when you're ordered and everybody's ordered. means that you have to come. If you don't come, it doesn't matter if everybody actually comes. But the point of
Mm.
ordering is that means everybody's expected to come. So if you choose not to come, then it's your fault for not turning up.
Yeah.
If the authority if the council makes an which is pertains to you, then it's your problem for not turning up. Okay, so but if you just come freely, if it's just an invitation, oh no, I don't want to come, then the council cannot bind you, because it has no, you're freely not going, and it has not got your consent. Therefore, it cannot bind you in there because there's no authority for that. So it's important that it's an authority that orders you there. Therefore, you expect to turn up. Therefore, if you don't, the authority can still apply to you because of the order. Now, the reason that the emperor can do this is because this is a church-state relation. We are to obey the emperor. And so is it wrong to, if the emperor calls us to a council, to declare to him what is the faith of the Catholic faith, or the Orthodox faith? What is the faith of the church? Well, no, of course, if he says to come and tell him what that faith is, well, we'll obey. And he's paying for all our expenses. So off we go. We'll go and declare to him what is the faith of the church. That's what he wants to know. That's our duty. He's ordered us to go there. So he can order that, but he can't interfere with what is actually decided. So it's a distinction. He can order the bishops together, but he has no right to tell the bishops what to believe. When the emperors tried to do that, it almost always came in complete disaster. Contrary to faith, they tried to impose their opinion. It did happen, but no, they weren't to do that. But the bishops required somebody above them for an ecumenical sense to. So in the first 3 centuries, they just had local synods, and they each held their position. But in the case of Easter on the 40 days, Asia held something different from the others, and they couldn't force it. They argued and squabbled about it. Pope tried to have a go at them and get them to do it, but he couldn't actually force them to do it. But he had no authority to force them to do it. So they had their freedom in this. So it was not until the Ecumenical Council came along, which decided the matter, which they were forced to the emperor's obedience to the emperor and to the council called by that, to have to conform. And then they changed the practice to uniformity of the rest of the churches. So the emperor has provided the ecumenical. Now, it has to be the emperor who was normally ecumenical, the ruler of the world. So the Empire of Rome, this is important why the empire is in place. It was the rule of the nations. It was the rule of the world. Now, it didn't literally rule the whole world. It didn't rule China. It didn't rule the Persian Empire. It didn't rule India. But symbolically, it was understood as the rule of the world. And so when Constantine called the council, bishops from outside the empire, from Scythian lands, from Persia and stuff, all turned up to it, because it was a symbolic order to come. It's understood that the whole church is together. And so he could carry that weight of that order because of his position as Roman emperor, and because of the position of the empire. And this, even when the empire collapsed later on, and by the 14th century, etc., the emperor continued to have that, because it wasn't about his actual territorial power. It was a symbol of what he was vis-a-vis the churches scattered around the world, as it has his secular symbol, which he carried on even though the empire by this time was shrunk. So he calls them together. They come, and the bishops have their own one who presides as bishop among the bishops. But the emperor is there to keep peace and keep order. And there's a double thing about this as well, which not so much necessarily of Constantine, but it probably was that the emperors, the decisions of the church become imperial law. So the canons of the church become imperial law. So not only the councils sort of church councils, there are interesting church interface state councils. So what they did was proclaim the faith to the world, and then the state, wanting to be a state under God, took this as its own faith, and I like to sort of as its constitution. So the empire, soon after Constantine, not actually, but his initiation became where the bishops set the constitution of the state. What is the divine law in which the state exercises its secular laws, consistent? So, and they're separate powers. So it's quite important that the emperor can't appoint. Oh, can I finish this point? And this one before we come back. The emperor cannot ordain bishops. There's no such thing as Caesar papirism in the sort of Eastern Church. No, he had no right to serve as a priest or ordain bishop. The bishops themselves did this, and the bishops had no right to work for the government. The two were separate. However, the bishops set the constitution of the state, so that the moral law, the framework in which the state exercises its own justice, but the estate does little minor things. So, example of this, in Christ sometimes come up, or give me my inheritance. I had an argument with my brother about this, and Christ says, no, what's this to do? What's this to do with me? Christ is not there to sort of argue about our secular little details and squabbles there. He's getting us in our right position with God. And so it's for the state to do this, not the church to start interfering in that sort of detail. That's properly a secular matter, which is the state does. Otherwise, we'd fall into sort of little courts of dealing with petty worldly things, and we'd lose our distraction of bringing souls to Christ. So this is quite important that we have this relationship between the church and state, where they're intertwined, but not they're separate authorities who are separate. And that's right. The other problem is that the church doesn't choose the leader of the empire. So it doesn't matter if the leader is chosen by assassination or coup or whatever. The church accepts whoever the secular state decides is its proper leader. The church will accept and anoint them. It's not the church to argue what the secular means are for the emperor to be put in place. Just as they can sort of make it say, hey, this is a bit sinful. They can make a comment, but ultimately they accept. And just as the emperor can't force, he can give consent to someone becoming the patriarch and say, oh, look, I really don't want to work with this guy. But ultimately, the church says this is the guy. he has to live with that. So there's a sort of relationship between the two, but not the ultimate decision making. And this is where the biggest problem of the Western church is when the Pope made Charlemagne the emperor contrary to the imperial order of who it was. He established himself as a political player who could appoint the ruler of the empire without the proper political system of the empire being put into place. So this was really the first rupture of the imperial commonwealth, that the Christian commonwealth in its secular form was in the papacy started claiming that. And then you get the papacy started to claim imperial authority, this church authority over the state. This is a different type of relationship. And so we've got the relationship was not differentiation of church and state like in the US, which has a problem. We'll talk about that more later. It's not that the church rules the state as a sort of like an Islamic caliphate where, they are ruled by the clerics. And nor does the state rule the church like in England, where the king is a head of the church and basically appoints the bishops through his ministers in the government. Each has a separate authority structure, a separate hierarchical structure. We can't interfere with each other. It appoints itself. But the state chooses the church to found its constitution, and the church recognizes the state that plays to form the secular laws in the day-to-day and things. And each has its sphere, which the other doesn't get involved with, but they're also united together. So I've just gone into a little bit up there, but this is a Justinian process. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah. So what I'd like to do is go back to the 4th century and start getting into more detail about what you just outlined about the adoption by the state of the church's moral precepts, for example. Now, Justinian gets, I think, maligned a lot for being the bogeyman that did all of this bad stuff by corrupting the state with that awful Christianity. But I think if you and I can dig down a bit more into the pre-Justinian period and during his period and post his period, so let's cover, say, from 600 to 900, and start looking at how the Christian moral precepts became embedded in secular law. But before I do that, I want to just refer to what Blessed Philip was saying in his commentary on the explanation to the Romans. I better just show this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just show this for everyone. So get the screen big. Yeah. So Blessed Philip comes from the Romans 13. It's reinforces, well, the apostle Paul himself is stating how the people who occupy these secular powers are, of course, going to endorse the divine virtue and vice versa, because those rulers are themselves, obliged to themselves be good Christians, use their conscience, etc., etc. So I think that, let me say that again. If someone who is occupying a secular power of position is similar in the sense that those people who are under their administrative authority, the secular authority, that same moral obligation is on all of them, on everybody, whether you're in authority or under authority, to use your conscience, fulfill the commandments of the Lord, exercise virtue in a divine way. So I think we're appealing to the Apostle Paul for this. So now, Father, let's go to 330, the establishment of Constantinople, which I think, nominally the Second Rome. And let's try to make our conversation. Let's parcel out our conversation to like pre-Justinian, during Justinian, and post-Justinian, so that we can drill down to how how did Christian moral precepts become embedded in civil law, for example? How, what happened to the church during this period? So so let's start with the 4th century.
Yeah, we'll just go back to Romans 13 for a second. It does say that there's a Scottish person talk about the relation of the Church of Scotland with their government there, and it did point out that the civil authority is a servant of God as well. And if you're a servant of God, you should be obeying God's rules. They are appointed as servants of God to do His will, and so it is proper that the state authorities should be under God's rule, which is why the church's doctrine and laws and canons as such become the state law, because of course the person in the state must obey these laws first and primarily, because they are a servant of God. Now, going on to Constantinople, what happens here is that, as I said, Peter and Paul went to Rome as the first city because it was a capital city of the empire. The authority given to it is patrine. It's from God. It's Christ chose. This is part of God's will and everything like that. And the church authority is a church authority. It's not trying to take the state authority, but they went to the place of the empire specifically to put this particular church authority in this specific place, because it was the imperial city, because it was emperors. Now, what happened, and so it's given to Rome as the city of the empire, the capital of the empire. This is why that Peter's authority, primary authority, went there. It is God's authority; it's all from there. But the reason for it being there, rather than in a little town, backwater town, as somewhere else in the empire, was because it is a capital city, and that's exactly why Paul went there. Now, in Constantine, not only did he call a First Ecumenical Council, but for some reason or another, as a way of expressing the needs of the empire, he took the city of Byzantium and said, hey, this is actually a new good place to have as for the capital of the empire. So he builds a new city there. But he doesn't just build another capital city. So emperors were sitting in Milan, they were sitting in Nicaea, they had different cities from which they were operating as their sort of mobile capitals. But the capital proper sat in Rome, where the Senate was based. So you have the Senate was there. Going back into the empire, the Republic, the Senate was quite core. So the Senate didn't exist or live in these other places. So the proper capital was still Rome. And so when he found Constantinople, he doesn't just make it another imperial residential city. He actually says that this, and then the proper name for it, the first name of it, this is Rome. This is New Rome. And he establishes it on 7 hills like the Rome of old, and he puts a Senate in it. He brings a Senate to here. And so what he does is that this is Rome, the New Rome. This is the same capital city as the other one. It's not another capital. There's one capital, but it's another clone of it. It's another manifestation of it in this place. So you've got a double manifestation of the one city, Rome, that is the one capital of the empire now in 2 places. And the one is called the senior older Rome, which takes priority as a prototype, as the historical starting point, as a father in a sense, generating a son. So it takes a sort of priority over that new one. But a new Rome, in effect, actually after this becomes the effective capital of the empire from that time on through to the demise of Constantinople as a capital city of the empire, which in 1453 when the Ottomans took over it. And even then the Ottomans effectively still use it as their capital until basically the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So what we have here is he says this is Rome, and this becomes a secular city. Now, as I said, the church doesn't, if a new city comes up and it doesn't replace the old one, the priority stays in where the church priority already was, and the other one could get some honor. But in this case, it wasn't like he made a city Constantinople and just lived there, in which case, following Leo the Great, he would give certain honor to the bishop there, but the bishop himself wouldn't displace anyone else's rankings. He would keep his ecclesiastical ranking would stay there. He'd get an honored title. He might be dressed a little bit more smartly or whatever, have some sort of cosmetic type authorities that go with it. But essentially, he would have to keep in his proper relation to the other sees around him. What happens with Constantinople is that Constantine's not thinking about it as another city, where it's the same city as Rome. This is Rome. And so when they recognized this is one city in 2 places, they went, well, hold a minute. That means that the Bishop of Byzantium is now the Bishop of Rome. He is the Bishop of Rome, just as the other bishop in the Rome on the Tiber is the Bishop of Rome. Well, in that case, whatever the authority that Peter gave to the bishop in Rome as a bishop of the capital city, because the 2 are one city, not because of a territorial location, which didn't matter, but because of the imperial city, and identified closely, 7 hills, the Senate, everything was mapped across. So all the things that identified the city as the capital, and what it meant is that as Rome was replicated there. So there's an identity of the 2 cities. When they realized that this identity, then they had no choice that what was given to Rome must also apply to this, because this is the same city. It's a clone. Everything that's given by the church, right, also must be accepted as being given to the Bishop of Byzantium. He is now the Bishop of Rome. And but they say, well, because of the church structure, we we still recognize Old Rome as first. So we talk about this one as second to the other one. So it's still one. You have to have otherwise you split into two equal fractions, and it causes a division. So you still keep the old one, both because it's a prototype, and also to remain the unity. But otherwise, the Bishop of Constantinople, or New Rome, had all the equal powers of the Bishop of Old Rome, and everything that was given to him, the privileges were exactly the same because he was the bishop of the same city. And its terms of its hierarchical use of ranking, and not in the sense of its geographical location as a diocese. So obviously a different diocese, but because of its other identification is capital. This is where, and you see this explained more in Canon 28 in the 5th century when they go through this. And that was, I'll just go a little digression here. The main purpose of that canon was both to expand the earlier canon of the 381, where so the first ecumenical council, this hadn't finished. So Rome wasn't completed. The new Rome wasn't completed. This is about another 8 years later or so. So the second ecumenical council says this, but it's already been accepted. They're confirming what they had no choice but to confirm because of what happened. And this was actually an important part. The emperor had the ability to do this. No one else could do this. So you can't do this, say, oh, this is another Rome in another country. No, it has to be the person with a proper secular authority of the empire to make this claim about the city, and it's established. It can't be an outsider just saying, oh, this is now Rome. No. It has to. There has to be a proper authority that it properly matches it, and it properly has a synod, which has the same families shifting across and there. So it's a whole connection to a whole 1,000-year history of Rome, Republic, etc. that is continued in here. You can't just pop this out somewhere else, which is why I say this is for a discussion we're going to have a little bit later about so-called Third Rome. So yes, he takes on that. He says also that's why Leo goes also that we can't change it of three: Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. There's the three. You can't change that order. That's true. You can't change that order. You can't insert a new see in this order without destroying the tradition of the church. Because I said the church took this and it keeps it as its own tradition. So we can't start messing around with these orders of bishops. So they're set. And once they were set, they remain set. And so what happens is, well, how does the Constantinople get second? Well, it becomes second because it's the same. It's first equal. So it is Rome. So there's still only the order Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. It's just that Rome is now in 2 bishops. So just as the See of Peter is in 3 bishops, but the one See of Peter, the See of Rome is in 2 bishops, but it's still one See of Rome. Just as Peter and Paul are also equal to each other, but we call Peter the one leader, but he's really in 2, Peter and Paul. His authority gets split into 2 representative. It's the same authority, the same thing. And so, yeah, this is we can see this in the apostle relationship. So it is just one city, Rome. They are one see in 2 places. And you see one of the bishops of Constantinople saying that to one of the popes, affirming this. So there's the same structure going through. Now, this is a little complex for most people to get, but I've discovered that you keep trying to map, we just bound to the empire, etc. No, the church has its structure, which is independent, but there's a mapping onto it. So, yeah, so the fathers, it wasn't a political thing. It was, it's a political thing is so far as Constantine decided it was going to be Rome. But the actual logic for the bishop to be recognized is actually following the church logic, is following the logic of the apostles and applying it consistently. It is actually taking their logic and applying it to faithfully. So they had no choice because they were obeying the apostles, the will of Christ to do this. This wasn't just some political move to keep Constantine happy. Constantine didn't know about this. Constantine wasn't planning this. This was the bishops went, well, we just done something, which means that we.
Father, I'm going to jump in if you don't mind,
Yeah, yeah.
because while you were talking, I was just getting a little bit of a bird's eye view of the 300s, 400s, up to 527 or so when Justinian starts to rule. So the picture that I was getting was, yeah, you've described how the church can function uh, through this, these councils dealing with the falling away of we'll call them Nestorians and the Monophysites. Sorry if that upsets anybody. So because Alexander Schmemann, who um, I read bits of his book, he was making a point that in his opinion, which we don't have to agree with, but he was making the point was that with the falling away of the Copts and of the Orientals out Baghdad way and so on, that it shed a lot of those theological problems that those two centers represented, and it kind of meant a contraction, which he says caused Justinian to consolidate some of his symphonia and administrative procedures that we'll get onto in a second. But would you agree that what you've just described with New Rome, it's still Rome, uh, seems to be. Yep, that explains how. The second, third, fourth councils, they did their thing as they should. It looked like the church was functioning.
Yeah. It's just the church following for its the rules of the logic of a church, which actually supports a good chunk of the Roman Catholic point about the See of Peter. Yeah, we actually agree with that. It's just that they've gone to a sort of distortion about what that authority means, and they've also got an exclusivity of contracting it to simply Rome. That Petrine See is just simply Rome. The Apostolic See is simply Rome. That the Rome is simply Rome. Constantinople is not. And therefore, you get all this other political stuff trying to explain from their lens what's going on. But from our lens, they try to say, well, Constantinople is just a political play, etc., etc.
Let's add this. This is interesting. You bring that up because with Catholic polemics, there's a little bit of a glossing over of not only the falling away of the Nestorians and the Monophysites, but also on the Italian peninsula itself, the collapse of the political infrastructure of the so-called Roman Empire in that restrictive way, being a Western phenomenon, and the administration of the church from Ravenna, not from Rome, but from Ravenna. Uh, uh, in the wake of that collapse on the Italian peninsula and the degradation of life and society in that region. So what does that mean? That means that um, maybe Father Alexander Schmemann has a point that if there was a contraction or a consolidation in the total Roman Empire being administrated from Constantinople, given the falling away of Alexandria, Baghdad, and now Rome, I think that we can either agree or disagree with Father Alexander Schramm's point about it, but if you're happy, we can go straight on to looking at his reform, Justinian's implementation of administration reform and of church life, his theory of symphonia. So, is that a good segue? Are we doing a successful segue into
I
this?
think we can. Yeah, we can keep going. Yes, it was interesting if you look at just going to the Monophysites or the Copts with the Syriac Monophysites and in the Indian church. What you'll see is they though they have separated from Rome, they still maintain Alexandria and Antioch as their patriarchal sees of Peter. So they will still cohere around this. And what's interesting is that the church in India for a long, long time, recognized Antioch as its proper patriarch. So that they still maintained with their Petrine See of Antioch. It's only recently there's been a sort of split in that way where they sort of more independence, which is sort of more modern thing. But for a long time, they recognized Antioch. Now, the Nestorians, they had a problem because no one in the patriarchates continued Nestorian. So there was an exarchate around Baghdad, so there were a lot of Eastern churches. And of course, they went further east in mission. So a lot of the Chinese Christianity was, and the Mongols were influenced by Nestorians because they sort of spread them that way. And there was a sort of block for the Orthodox churches to move forward. But when Georgia became a Christian nation, under Nina's testimony they called priests from Antioch to come there. And it was an Antiochian mission until it got its independence from Antioch, sort of become a sort of self-exarch or Catholicus or whatever they call the guy. But it's an exarch there. I mean, unfortunately, Russia interfered with that and tried to bring it under its patriarch, which should never have done. Then Constantinople says, we freed it and gave it its independence later, and you see it got its independence from whatever the Constantinople. No, it had its independence from Antioch, which was its proper founder. So it just is important to the whole mission aspect of this. So anyway, going back to the symphony of, I don't think Justinian actually did anything particularly different. He just expressed what was already established. So Constantine basically kicks it off. Then Theodosius effectively makes Christianity the formal religion of empire. I think it's his son Theodosius II or something, or another Justinian a little bit later. So that's the end of the 4th century. In the early 5th century, this is the legal systems start coming into place. So this is Theodosius II or something. So you start seeing this. So the symphony is actually already in place in the late 4th century in a form way, though Constantine basically starts it off. It's completed by then. But Justinian basically is the full expression of this. This is when it flowers and its full glory in a sense, in its full maturity of the system. And under Justinian. And of course, So that's there. He's only in the 5 patriarchs at this stage. So what happens is Jerusalem is also recognized. It's not a Petrine See per se, but it's given a special place of honor because of its holy city, etc. But it's a sort of a relatively minor patriarch. It was not even of an exarch. It was a sort of a small 3 Palestine sort of thing. And you'll notice that the patriarchs have to respect the rights of metropolitans to keep ordaining bishops and stuff. They sat on a level above, but they had to they couldn't overturn. It's because they recognized that they didn't interfere with the rights of the metropolitans underneath them, which was established essentially by the apostles. So so we get this the pentarchy at this stage. But that is fascinating. It's not just 5 patriarchs. It's 1 Rome and 2, and it's 1 Petrine See and 3, 4, and then you've got so you've got the 1 Rome and New Rome. Then you've got the Petrine See, which is Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch is foundated. But of course, New Rome is also takes the same privilege. It's not a Petrine See as founded by Peter, but it has the same privileges as a Petrine See. So it's functionally a Petrine See, even though not founded as a Petrine See. So you've got these 4, which are really functionally Petrine Sees, which is why, and then Jerusalem under with that. And that is why that was the core of the church basically right up to the 16th century. Now you get Bulgarians claiming a patriarchate with the title of that, but it's more like an exarchate. The Petrine Sees can't extend beyond these 3/4. See that is the Petrine See. It can't be transferred. It can't be moved. And even if the Rome as a city collapsed, it kept its status. Now, what happened was, of course, Rome. I'll just jump ahead a little bit. Seeing it's just useful to explain this at the moment. Is when Rome split from New Rome. Old Rome split in this time of a schism. This is because the teachings of New Rome Old Rome, had sort of changed the dynamic of what it meant to be the Patron See. It had taken exclusivity to itself. It's claiming to be able to ordain people. It's claiming a right over the kings and stuff, which destroyed the symphony of Justinian here. So that's one of the key things, which has already happened in the 9th century, I said before. But the key thing for the Orthodox, when Rome fell, the Orthodox lost nothing of the Tri-See, because New Rome was effectively is Rome. So Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch remain at the core of Orthodox ecclesiology. We haven't lost anything by losing Old Rome. It fell off because it decided to exclude itself. But everything that's said about Rome, it tries to New Rome. And you'll see historically that the early century millennium position Rome, Constantine played exactly the same role across all the churches, the influence it had, etc. In the East, the stability it's had since then. It's been Orthodox. It's had the odd bad case, but it's been very stable until recent times, at least. So is Alexandria and Antioch have been very stable. In the first centuries, they had much more wobbling back and forward with their bishops, but since the fall of Rome, they've actually been all very stable in the faith. So the Petrine promises, up till this stage, even if we might moan and groan about things, has actually been extremely stable amongst these three cities. So I just wanted to make that point, that in the schism, nothing was lost of that, the pentarchy of Justinian, as when you sort of break it into that Rome, the Patron See, nothing was actually lost. Even if the pentarchy was reduced to a tetrarchy, the actual core of the three and Jerusalem didn't change. In the matter of fact, Old Rome had a problem because they lost the traditional Alexandria. They actually had to basically deny that Alexandria and Antioch were Patron Sees. You'll see them trying to reestablish the sees under their own bishops later on. But yeah, they have actually have an ecclesia, but they lost something. They've lost the triple Patron See. The East never did. So anyway, that was my little digression.
So I think you made an important point when you said that the Justinian reforms, that concept of symphony between the administrative secular powers and the ecclesiastical spiritual role, was pre-Justinian. Really, it was Constantine who we can date it, that process starting from Constantine. Father Alexander Schmemann, he made the point that he made the point, which I think I agree with, which is that these codes, these Justinian codes, these state laws, they were a secular thing. They weren't a church thing. So it was civil law, and of course it was. But that civil law brought in the voice of the church into the state environment, the state.
Yes, and that's what I said. The church sets the constitution. It sets the divine law in which the state secular laws are created. The state secular laws don't have to literally put everything. They can nuance them in there because they're secular laws, but they are in the context of the church law. So when the ecumenical councils were effectively establishing not only what the church believed and the church did, they were also establishing what the empire did and what the empire believed. Now, can I go into a little thing of why this actually matters, that like this? So why don't the church and state and empire, like the USA, with a secular thing? Well, there's two reasons for this, or one primary reason is two reasons. This first one is you can't have a state without some form of underlying comprehension of reality which grounds the state's actions. It's just impossible. We can't have a secular world without some sort of comprehension of what reality is. And when you separate church and state, what you're doing is substituting Christian reality for whatever reality the secular people choose, whichever it's atheism or whether it's Buddhism or whatever. You can't have a thing. And so what happens is that the state ends up in a different worldview, and therefore its principles of why it makes laws, etc., start conflicting with Christianity because it's not deriving them from the gospel. It's not deriving them from God. So it'll end up in either opposition to the church, therefore trying to control the church, trying to force the church into its image, or the church will sort of end up revolting against the state because they'll come into disharmony, or the state or church of church is just a private opinion, and eventually it'll start to try to control the churches as being, oh, this is just a bunch of private opinions. We don't owe anything to them. And then it becomes a power politics. Whoever's in power decides what reality is. That's really what it comes down to in the secular states in the US. Whoever's in power determines reality, and all the morality that comes from their vision of morality. So it's an illusion to have this. Now, the next part about this is that you'll see in the Council of Trullo, it talks about maturity of faith, and that we can, now allow nuns to, instead of being 25 before you can become a nun, you can be 17. Why? Because the state, the faith is embedded. Now, what does that mean? What that means is the habits of and expectations of Christian life is established in the people. And how is that established? It's established because you grow up with it as children. The society around you lives it. So all the people around you are living this faith. So the expectations and norms of Christianity are well established in the day-to-day life of the people around. Now, the day-to-day life is actually driven more by secular laws and rules than it is directly necessarily from the church. They're intertwined together. And so for a proper fullness of a Christian polity, you need the state to also, in the way the local village councils, the wider councils, the state, this has to be Christianized too, so that everything, your schooling, everything that you're growing up with, your environment becomes Christian. Therefore, you get the full habitual natures of human life are Christianized, and you get a much deeper maturity of your Christian value. When you've got separated from church and state, you might get the church, the state, schools telling you kids things that are contrary to Christianity. So you've got to keep under, and they get influenced by their friends and stuff. It's very hard to create a strong, mature Christian faith when you've got all these influences. You've got to unpack it. Do you homeschool all your children so you keep them free, but then they can't engage in the state life because they get lost because it's a completely foreign culture to them. And then you'll end up sort of more ghetto-y, but that's not helpful either because the church never became ghettoized. It works among the people around them. So we can live in an environment where the state teaches things otherwise, but we can't think that there's a sense we can survive fully. We're actually better when the state is properly Christianized and its laws are founded in the Christian laws, then its rules, and then we have a maturity that comes amongst us. And then it's much better for us because we all grow and we're all supporting each other in the village. Everyone's thinking the same thing. The laws which we're working on, we're not sort of contradicting each other. Children are not rallying because the state says this and you say this. It removes this. And there's much greater symphony and development of a full Christian life through all the practices, for all the ways we do it. And it's good to have it that the state's there so that the church is not trying to legislate little minor details. It's trying to involve itself in secular affairs. It keeps itself focused on what it's to do, which is bring souls to union with God. And let the state worry about little tiny details of things. And the villages work at it. But they need to be informed of Christianity so that our children grow up firmly established in principles and the way that villages and towns work is fully infused with Christianity. So, yeah, so the proper society in a sense, a Christian sense, is one where the state but it's not the church controlling the state. The state needs a certain freedom, and in that freedom, it can allow certain movements of people that are not Christians and stuff. We don't want to start to try to impose Christian law fully through it. It's more that the law of a state reflects and supports Christian law, but not necessarily just imposing it in a sort of complete total way, because that that can become problematic too. You've got to have people some freedom to be.
I'll comment on what you've just said from the point of view of Father Alexander Schmemann and Father John Romanides, who say the same thing here, which I'm going to paraphrase, that they say there's a symbiotic quid pro quo whereby the state will foster the church so that the church will produce sane, healthy, spiritually healthy people that, of course, will demonstrate good morals and become good functioning citizens of the state. So I'm talking about that quid pro quo thing between state and church. The paradosis, I think, is another word for that enculturation of good Christian Christianity through secular means. But should we take this further? Let's take this idea of that quid pro quo, symbiotic relationship, symphony, a bit further. Because one of the things we will distinguish is a point you just made. The church is not dictating. Sorry, the state is not dictating to the church how the church should be at all, and and it's not a theocracy because why? Because as Father John Romanides and Father Alexander Schmemann is saying, yeah, those citizens are just good Christians who have a noetic understanding and a spiritual maturity. That's so. How far can we take this here?
Well, the state also has to deal with people who are not Christians. And so if you just have a Christian rule, how do you deal with any law or anything for those who are not in the church? The church has no authority over them as church. As a bishop or presbyter, I only have authority over those members of the church. So a state has to work with those who are not there. And we don't want to force people into Christianity. It's a free choice. It's a free matter. Now, that doesn't mean the state can't have certain things against heretics, etc., or can say you've got to be an Orthodox Christian to be a member of Parliament or something like that. Well, that's because the Constitution is Orthodox Christianity or Christianity as such. So in a sense, we don't want the government to be taken over people who are opposed to Christianity because therefore they would actually destroy the symbiosis, which is the actual the constitution of the state. Through their power politics. So there has to be a sense of say, well, this is what we are as a state. We will we'll tolerate you in a sense, and we won't try to force you to be there. And we need to make laws so that it works for you as well. And so that sometimes the strictness of Christian laws may need to be relaxed in a sense for some people outside the church. We can't start imposing all the church things. So it's not a theocracy in the sense that the state has a wider gambit of legislation of who it's working for than it does than the church has. They have a different sphere of actual people under whom they're working. So that's how I would say it. It's not saying everybody has to be a member of a thing or you're outcast. No, you can be a full functioning member of the state as a Jew or a Muslim or etc. As long as you recognize that the state is a Christian state that is guided by the principles of Christianity and not Judaism stuff. And so there is a level of toleration. Now, this can be sometimes abused. This can be that people are always balance between freedom and control and forcing and exalting. And so there's always this. And so you all find history was always imbalances and stuff like that. But that's different from a theocracy like Islam, where it is an Islamic state. Everything is Islamic. The laws are all Islamic. There's no sort of real coping or distinction between them to say that you're in the state and you're not under the Islamic rule, but you're still a full citizen of the state. Whereas this church-state relationship can have that. You can still be full citizen and not Christian, and you are not under Christian rules as a Christian because their rule doesn't extend out to you. You're under a state law, even though the state law is informed by the Christian laws. It has its own sphere. So those laws don't necessarily have to totally map up. It can have a certain movement because of this different structure of the relationship.
Yeah. So I think we might move into the 9th and 10th centuries, but well, 10th centuries, but um, I think that post Justinian, it probably is in the video that I just read from Alexander Schmann's review, the Epanagogian 9th century documents, Emperor Basil I Macedonian codified, I think, a lot of the formation of the uh, state according to what was initiated by Constantine and continued by Justinian. Uh, and so I think we'll move into the 10th century if unless there's anything more to say about that period in
No, I think it's
time.
fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
the only thing is that the ninth is of course, the whole Charlemagne and the paper, which I touched on earlier.
Yeah.
Do we want to talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit?
Yeah, exactly. So that's where we're kind of heading now, because you made that huge important point that that so-called Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne's was crowned by his German his German Pope. So that was a real. You made the point that that was a real change in that Carolingian state with that person occupying the cathedra in the city of Rome. That was a real change. Um, uh, so perhaps we should talk about. Should we talk about that? Should we talk about the Charlemagne Frankish thing, the Crusades? Should we talk about these things? I mean, because I think we probably should, because I think this deceives a lot of Westerners. I think a lot of Westerners are subconsciously bound by whatever that particular framework, that Carolingian framework was, and that event was.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yes. No, it's a
yeah.
huge
So we should.
influence in the way a lot of Westerners think about the Symphony of Justinian. They keep talking about Caesaropapism, etc. That's because they've got a Roman Catholicism or the papacy, which started claiming temporal powers, temporal control, and you get temporal. It's got its own armies, it's got its own states, etc. It claims it's temporal, and it's like even Vatican City now is a sort of a political thing. So this sort of a power over the emperors. Now, they claim it's about interference of the emperors and ordinations, etc. And there was a problem with that. But the canons of the church already speak of that, and that those are to be rejected. The church doesn't need to say anything more. That it's already been recognized. And it's a bishop's thing. So there was no need to claim some other power, which they did to reinforce this. This is something different, actually. And it's sort of the false decree. The decretals, whatever, from the same Constantine, given the Pope this sort of power, that they came up with in the 9th century, 8th, 9th century to sort of bolster their position. But no, it's quite important for the symphony. And right way back to the way Christ speaks is that the church doesn't become a political actor. It's not in charge of armies. It's not able to appoint the emperors and stuff. That's different from anointing the emperor. Therefore, given a sort of recognized emperor in a sense of, who isn't in a sort of another position of Christ in the sense there is a sort of a mystical position of the emperor in the sense of manifesting Christ in a certain type and manner. As a God's servant. So there's a place where the church anoints the there and gives them, and they do get a certain honor among, like come onto the altar place or something like that to offer but they don't ever the bishops never serve as priests. They have no authority in the councils to actually to have a vote. I don't like the word vote, but to have their express their opinion or to be counted as one of the points of consent and doctrine or speak on them. So I think Justinian was a little bit thrown himself in. He was pushing the border of that to a degree. But he didn't overstep the particular line on that. And so the emperors can't all just say, oh, this guy's going to be a bishop. Now, of course, there's always historical times when they try to do that and they put pressure on the church and stuff like that. And sometimes the bishops felt constrained to have to follow that because they're going to get their heads chopped off and all the rest. The power of a sword was always quite strong. But it never should be political, nor should the church ever be the one that's appointing and saying, this will be the emperor. And this is exactly sort of what happened. And yeah, and in the crowning of Charlemagne, the papacy is basically saying it had authority to appoint the emperor of the empire, apart from the imperial system itself. Even though they might have had an excuse at the time because a woman was on the throne of Irene at that time, and they said, well, she's not really an emperor. Maybe they're right, but that didn't excuse him still. Then they said the throne was empty to actually do it. They could only exhort the people to say, well, appoint someone proper, no, this is no good, you've got no emperor. But that's a civil matter. And if the civil people go, oh, we're happy to have her there, well, okay, that's their problem. That's not the church problem. Even if the church says, well, we can't recognize them as a true icon of Christ in their role. Nevertheless, it's not the church's position to deselect them. They could just oppose them on Christian grounds. But so this was a huge thing when they did this, and that's why you get these false decretals coming up to bolster this, because it was so. And they tore apart the unity of the Christian empire, the Christian commonwealth. There was the commonwealth, the unity of the empire reflected the unity of the faith, the unity of the church is all here. It's a symbiosis because it's both pointing to the same oneness. And this is what I can go in a whole big discussion. I'd like to maybe a little moment or two on this point. So yeah, where they ruptured this, and this is actually really the point that the beginning of the rupture between the East and the West in churches, the schism, because they ruptured the secular part of it. And it was only in time where the church part effectively ruptures as well. You've got two empires that are not the same. And that ruptures ends up, and that is really the line in the rupture of the churches because of the influence of Charlemagne and the Frankish courts on the Rome. Really, even though Rome claiming its power over it, there's an influence back that's symbolized. They can't escape it, and that sort of leads to Rome re-identifying itself in a way which made it impossible to keep it east. All that influence, and then ruptured the two. So in this act in the 800 was huge impact. It came out in 200 years later. Thankfully, it's slow because of the mercy of God, but it's a really important point. Now, I wanted to. Can I go in my little discretion?
Oh yes.
Yeah. Now, what else? Why? The question is, why does the empire take Christianity? Why on earth did Constantine start putting Christianity in place? Well, ultimately, Christianity and the empire are natural bedmates because they're actually pointing to the same thing. They are pointing to a unity of people, but recognizing as sort of a local diverse. It's like a federalism in a sense, but the converging into one. But like recognizing local divisions. So in the Roman Empire, each nation sort of basically has quite a lot of autonomy in itself, as long as it stayed within the empire. And this is like the church, where each region has its own ways of doing things. That's why I said the local synods, they have determined their local practices. When do we have our liturgy? What sort of liturgy do we have? They tend to copy the central sees, so there's a sort of harmony. But there's also a diversification. You see this in the West before the Trent and all that. England had its own way of doing the rituals. Spain, each one had its own ritual. Though they had a commonality which is drawn from Rome, but they had their own ways. And you see this in the East. They start to draw from Constantinople. Everyone sort of follows the John Chrysostom and Basil as Constantinople does it. Even though Constantinople pinched a little bit from Jerusalem earlier, it's cross influence. But then its missions, obviously, they feed back. But then they have their own local customs. So the Russians do their things in a slightly different way than the Greeks and things. So the vistas we see today in the East, though there tends to be Constantinople, without imposing itself, tend to get a higher degree of consistency from everybody following its practices than old Rome had prior to sort of Trent, when it started to impose itself on others and forcing them by decretal to do it this way, rather than them doing it because they are copying. So it's just, but the empire, this worked very well, this relationship between, and the Christians were to obey the rulers. And if the rulers obey Christianity, then the people are going to be there. You're going to be a state of peace, because you've got the religion reinforces the empire and supports that. It's not trying to rebel against. It's not trying to, like the Jews, we've got our own nation and we'll do our own thing. No, it's the empire's cool. We'll follow. It's a universal church. It's a unit of faith for all peoples and all things coming into one. Again, this helps the empire to realize itself. And I think ultimately for myself, and I think this is playing out with our experience since then, is with all our attempts of communism and capitalism and all these other secular state relations, Protestantism, the king in charge of a church, etc., that the way humans work, the reality of existence is properly grounded in Christianity. It is what reality is. And therefore, the Christian way of behavior, etc., is what is most natural to man. Not that it's according to our passions, but according to our constitution. So if we learn to put aside the passions, as the Christians say, we actually come to the most perfect relationships with each other, and one that lends to support to a universal empire as well, the type of relation where everybody's fundamentally happy as a human being, neither being constrained by tyranny from on top, even though emperors sometimes did fall to that degree and sort of put that abuse, and there's problems with tax and stuff. Okay, but there's a fundamental freedom within that as well, nor disintegrating into sort of anarchy, etc. So it's order with proper respect of freedom. And this is why a lot of even atheists would be happy to live in a Christian country, because Christians have a certain level of toleration and a certain love of the enemy, etc., which is an expectation. Now, it's always abused. There's times of the Crusades and the Inquisitions and stuff, but that shows a corruption in the Western way of thinking, and because they were trying to take control, and it's falling from unifying people by respect of their freedom to controlling people to do what you want. And humans, organizations on humans always devolve into a tyranny of control, people wanting you to do what they want to do, and they're trying to control you. And they expect when you do obedience, it always becomes the other one's controlling me, because they can't get out of this relationship of free obedience. Obedience is always controlled, because that's a human secular way of thinking. And they think of God controlling us. And well, why can't God make us good? Because they fail to understand the proper dynamic of the freedom of the individual but the coherence and unity around God in that. And this gets distorted everywhere. So Christianity, and I think they're a lot smarter than those. The emperors realized this is actually the best thing for the empire. And it was a stable empire. It lasted for 1,000 years. The only pressures were the attacks from outside, so they just physically couldn't keep going. But the society, the culture, as a political continuation, even they had fights and sort of people backstabbing and assassinations and sort of coups and stuff. But the structure itself wasn't changed. It's just different persons was put in power, and it was very stable. So that's my thing, is why it's there, is because it's actually how humans, and of all societies, I don't see anything as actually being better in a stable long-term manner. The US can say it's sort of really good, but separating church and state, it's starting to fall into power politics and the difference in opinions on how humans should work, and that's creating a rupture in the US through there. And it's also caused a problem of way of church-state relations, which is the idea of a local church, a grounded church, a church which is the default church in each village, sort of thing. And you've got to this thing of, and you go to one church, you go to the local Orthodox church, the Catholic church, and it's in the same in every village, where you've got this denominations. Everyone, you just jump between denominations. There's no sort of doesn't matter whether you're in the same church, and that church is a local church. Like in England, for example, the church where you get baptized, where you get married, it's all has to be your parish. You're a member of that parish. And therefore, when you move to another one, you have to be transferred from this parish books to the other parish books. And there's a sense of stability in our church life. When the denominations, the Christianity becomes a personal opinion. It becomes I go to my flavor. I like this one. I prefer that one. There's no sense of obligation to be at this one other than going this one. So it breaks down a stability to the church and of Christian life, and a movement towards orthodoxy of opinion, to have the one thought, one faith, one mind with the church. So it causes other problems. Anyway, so there we go. I just a little digression.
Yeah. Oh no. So I agree with you. Your roundup there. You used the word natural. So I think you're agreeing with me and with Father Alexander Schmemann and Father John Romanidis that Christianity reflects the natural anthropology of being soul and body, and wearing. Yeah, and that's exactly what a state would want. I imagine. So I think that before, after we stop talking about the West and the Franks, I'd like to take us over to Kiev and then Moscow. But perhaps there are some important points we're just missing out on with the with that Western influence of what had happened there in those Carolingian reforms and that Frankish imposition upon Western culture, because like maybe there's nothing more to say except that you're presenting us with the fact that they've got a different model of statehood now, and and within that statehood they've got another model of church which is not an orthodox one. Is there anything else to say about that?
Well, yes. I mean, I think you fall into sort of almost two camps where you've either got papal control and authority to the extent where states feel that they are constrained as a state under this papal authority. So you get Henry VIII sort of revolting. And then once you revolt against that, you end up collapsing into a sort of national churches where the church actually becomes under the state. The state takes control of the church because they're in revolt to the Rome taking control of them. And so you've got this interplay that's either the Pope is a ruler of all, or the state is a ruler of all, or you can collapse into sort of like, well, none. We're completely independent from the state, and we just live in our little ghettos of our religion, sort of the Baptists, etc. So you get all this sort of taking off. So yeah, there's all that different type of dynamics going on where the proper balance between state and church is missing, proper balance between locality, etc., and control is missing. So if you to take away the decentralization and the sort of political power in some ways of the papacy, you will be, the real Reformation would have been quite a bit different. There's lots of other reasons for it. It's a whole way of their thinking, their theology had become corrupt by this stage, and so there's lots more. But so definitely the state-church relationship was affected from that, from the 11th century when Rome really put its place in. But it comes back to the 9th, and that's affected, I think, Western state relations ever since.
Well, that's interesting, Father. I can see how a certain kind of nationalism was generated from in Europe, in Northern Europe, because of those two factors that you've just referred to, which are I'm going to say it, the papal powers as the papal powers as a civil power, or this other kind of strange mystical model of church life being absolutely nothing to do with secularity at all, because I think that with the emergence, in later centuries of the modern state as a civil as political entity, the rise of that. But before the rise of that, the need for in this Protestant Catholic wars going on, the need to, what's your state? What's your religion? What's your state? What's your religion? Are you Catholic? Are you Protestant? This is a kind of nationalism, I'd say, that was generated there. And why I say that is that something that sticks to me, which I'd like to mention, is I think there was one traveller throughout the Turkish Empire down in that part of the world who. He was an Englishman, and he was frustrated because he wanted to know what nationality a local man was, because he was probably a Slav, but he was doing the liturgy in Greek, but the Turks were in control. And the Englishman was so frustrated because that Orthodox Christian man just said, "I'm a free man. I'm a free man. I'm a free man." So he didn't have a national identity. He had his ethnic identity, but not a national one. And his religion, in his words, meant he was just a free man. And
yeah. Although this is a whole other Christian thing, of course, we are free in Christ in the sense, and where our nation is the church or Israel. Really, we really are, and so but we're not we're all nations together in the church. So we transcend national identities because our primary identity is in Christ. Now, that doesn't mean that I cease to be Anglo Anglo-Scot, which is probably best explained my genetic heritage. Now, of course, I'm an Anglo-Scot in there. It doesn't mean I don't divide myself from somebody who's an African for that. My identity within the church is much closer than my brothers in Christ. But I still maintain, because I don't destroy my body, I stay who I am, and that's part of my identity. So we keep the emphasis. But the nationality, especially when you think about empire as well, you're a member of it. Paul says, I'm a member of a citizen of an empire, which means you're beyond any nation. Now, you can have a certain sort of a localized ethno-nation type thing to some degree. But yes, the strong state nationhood stuff, that's a little foreign to Christianity again, because all nations are in one place. We're all brothers in Christ, so we don't separate ourselves from nations. Even though I might distinguish myself, and in local areas, I'll carry out a practice as a Anglo-Scot rather than carry out practices as a Romanian or as a Pole. Okay, we might have our own local customs, etc., reflecting our local areas, but that doesn't mean I'm any less of a brother with them and vis-a-vis the church. Yeah.
So I don't know. I think we don't need to continue to talk about Europe, because that might be a different topic, because it's going to be Catholic, Protestant conversation. But so if we still go back to the 9th century or 10th century, but turn our gaze eastward, well, okay, the Slavs, Kiev, Prince Vladimir, 10th century, the Kievan period before Moscow, predating Moscow, that seems to be a good example of functioning Christianity and functioning statehood. So this is before the Mongols kick in the 13th century. So what can you describe for us about this period of church life with the Slavs in that part of the world?
As far as I know, I mean, obviously they got interested in Christianity either through missions there, or the classic case of going down and seeing the Church of Holy Wisdom and seeing heaven on earth. They were influenced by Frankish missionaries. There was sort of looking back and forward, but eventually they just chose to to come under a mission scope of Constantinople. And so they keep their own state. Constantinople sends up initially sort of local bishops there, but I think eventually they started to ordain or approve the head bishop as being the local from Kiev. So Kiev becomes a metropolis. It becomes almost an exarchate over that region from about the 10th century onwards. And it refers to Constantinople as its proper patriarch. And that's correct. The canons, it says anything moving beyond the exarchates, because it's beyond their territory. The church, the metropolitans are fixed to their territory. They don't have any right to do anything outside their territory. Exarchs are fixed to their territory. So any mission beyond that must point to someone. That's one of the reasons they have the patriarchs who conduct the missions beyond the territories of the other ones. Now, everyone can do mission on the borders, but generally it's overtaken by the patriarchs to unify it and to, because it's going to be establishing a new metropolitans, new structures there. So the patriarchs tend to take this on. And then the East and the West divide. What's interesting is that, well, you can go to Rome or Constantinople. And in some ways they say, well, the people chose. We will prefer to come under here. So where the borderline crashes into each other, there was a sort of a choice of the people, and they chose. Bulgarians chose to go to Constantinople, even though there's moments when they try to go under Rome. Eventually, they came under, and so Kiev had the same tension, and decided. Well, you go a bit further now. Poland is happy to come under the Roman missionaries. And then you get the sort of Belarus, Western Ukraine, Latvia and stuff, where you sort of get a clash between these, which goes on for centuries, and there's tugs. But so Kiev follows that, and then church life develops. They have their own customs, identities, etc. But referring from and drawing from Constantinople. So the liturgy is essentially Constantinople's liturgy. And a matter of fact, just as a point of interest, the Russians to this day actually liturgically follow the rite of Constantinople of the 14th century more closely than modern Greek practice. I mean, some Greeks are starting to go back towards the older form, but the rites of the Russian church, though they have their own developments and tweaks, overall are actually much, much closer. The way the bishop dresses at the start of the liturgy, the way they sit on the synthronons, some of the other customs are actually more in line with the Constantinople of the 14th century than the modern Greek practices. So yes, so I'm just taking that as how they've drawn from Constantinople and maintained what they learned from Constantinople of that period. There was the old believer schism, so some of that's reflecting some older stuff, some of that's reflecting some divergences and developments that happened within the Russian sphere, and they try to update it again in the 17th century with Constantinople, which case Constantinople had changed a little bit this way. So they had sort of changed some of their practice as well. So it's interesting, the relationship. So 14th century, then it's not until Moscow starts to become more and more predominant. It, in a sense, is a separate metropolitan. So Kiev was the main one for the mission from there, but Moscow comes greater as a city later on. And then I think this is a very rough outline of history. There was problem because of Constantinople's taken by the Turks. It became increasingly difficult for Constantinople to send bishops to Kiev. And there's also a problem that Constantinople have a habit, which still do, of sending Greeks to run them instead of recognizing the local man. So if you go back to the 7th century in the West, for example, in the British, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he was appointed, he's not appointed by Rome, it's someone from Rome. Occasionally someone was sent from Rome across, like Augustine or so. But generally the English voted for, chose who they want, and then he went to Rome to get the pallium to be recognized as the arch by Rome, but not appointed. So as a local bishop was the one. Constantine have a habit of sending their favored people to be the head bishop, which caused some tension because there's like a little bit too much ethnic interference. This is that sort of control at a sort of, I'm putting my man from my ethnic background in there. That wasn't good. It's more like we'll just approve who you choose of your local ruler. So there's a local leadership here. So there's a bit of a revolt against Constantinople. And then there's political issues as well going on. And then eventually Constantinople, so there's actually two major metropolises or exarchates. You've got Kievan, and then you've got the Moscow one.
Let's just pause and come back to that just to delineate some of the history, because I think it was sequential, and I just having glanced through this book here, Alexander Schmemann, he's presenting this idea that it was sequential in the sense that it was the Mongols, the Tartars, the Golden Horde, that pretty much wiped out the functioning church and state life in Kiev, and 1237 to 40, wiping it all out by the stage, and with the domination of that Asiatic influence from the Mongols, Father Alexander Schmemann has a pretty idiosyncratic thesis that the rise of Moscow in the wake of that devastation and that power vacuum that the Mongols left imbibed and incorporated some of the autocratic spirit or ethos or intention or flavor from the Tartars. So I don't know if I go along with such a view, but the point just for our purposes now is that it did seem to be sequential. Kiev first, Moscow second, later, evolved later.
Yes,
and once we start talking about Moscow, then we'll start talking about Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, the synodal period, up to the Bolsheviks and so on. But would you agree with that chronology, that Kiev was functioning pretty well?
Kiev was a first functioning city, and then Moscow comes along later, and its rise is partly tied up with the problems, the political problems, the physical practicalities of what happened at Kiev with the Mongols, etc. So and then the Moscow managed to freer, then it sort of managed to push out and sort of reclaim the thing. So it sort of took a political dominance later on, sort of through the 14th, 15th, 16th century, that starts to take a greater political dominance in the area.
So what Father Alexander Schmemann is trying to do is explain why Moscow had a different ethos or approach or method or intent from Kiev.
Yes, well, it is interesting, to be honest. Now, my history analysis is not super. I've read it through, but I'm super detailed. Now, I'll hang back a little bit from the Moscow flavor there. There was some interesting things that what's happened with Moscow later on. I just wanted to point out that eventually Moscow claim was almost forced a hand on Constantinople. So it was recognized as a sort of metropolitan see, etc. And in a sense, it was actually, because it was a lot larger territory, it was sort of seen as a greater sense than Kiev. But Kiev was still the primary see for a while. Then I think they sort of got to political things. They said they tend to move to Moscow, and that sort of the location, just as Antioch sort of ended up in Damascus, that the Moscow tended to have a political, more superior sort of church life. However,
Father, just to clarify, this is usually framed in terms of the domination and the collapse of the Hellenic Empire because of the imposition of the Seljuk Turks, who just wiped out, Constantinople as a functioning polity. That's usually the framework, isn't it?
But it's still, yes. So there's a problem with that. But Constantine still kept its position. There was still the patriarch, and it's still recognised. Right. Well, about 100 years after the the time, but its ability to bring its effectively function. So, and eventually, I think Moscow sort of demanded its sort of independence because of probably its self-opinion, etc. And so it was granted. It was already, I think, recognized as a metropolitan see. Then it was granted a patriarchal status of the Patriarch of the North. So it sort of came out from the patriarchal authority of Constantinople and took on its own patriarchal authority, which is something new, actually. It sort of comes in after Jerusalem. But this is interesting that there is a sort of you got Alexander is a patriarch of Africa in a sense. So Antioch is of the East, which I argue would go right to the China, but their own people might argue it goes as far as Iran. What they know, but I do know that the Indian Church, for example, recognised the patriarch and the monophysite. So I think that India at least would come under Antioch. But anyways, it's probably the East, and so Rome, old Rome, was the patriarch of the West. And sort of Constantine had this little bit in the middle, but it ended up looking after the missions in Eastern Europe. So they granted a separate patriarchate in the same sense of the older patriarchs of being patriarch of the North, meaning the sort of northern Russian lands. But it was not quite to the same. It didn't become a Petrine patriarchate. It's a different type of patriarch, but it's more than just a sort of exarchate or a national sort of. The Bulgarians came and had something a bit bigger than that. Now, interesting, this Kiev was not part of that patriarchate. Kiev was still recognized. This is what I was saying about the tradition of the church. Even though Kiev was functionally done, it still recognizes its own metropolis and its own exarchate in its sense, and it is to this day. So, though, what had happened is, as I understand it, is that first the Patriarch of Russia, which didn't include Kiev and land, but after a while, due to other politics and things, problems that had happened in Kiev, this is a Roman Catholic influence, the splitting of the Uniates and all these sort of other influences that came on, and the movement of the churches sort of from Rome to Constantinople, eventually, and the problems of administering. As far as I take the Constantinople position, that Moscow was granted the authority to ordain the metropolitan of Kiev, but that was it. Kiev still remembers Constantinople as its proper patriarch, but in practice, over time, it's been assumed that the Kiev was underneath the Moscow Patriarchate as a proper part of the Patriarchate. I don't think that's ever actually the case. So I think Constantinople was correct on this, that it was only the ordination. But in practice, effectively, it became, and Kiev generally looked to Moscow, not completely. So you've got that relationship. But Moscow's interesting. It follows the Eastern way, but then it's heavily influenced in the 17th century. So I go into a little bit towards Peter and Catherine, etc. Just to build on what you were talking about.
Ivan before Peter as well, like in terms of.
Yeah, I don't know much about Ivan. So I think he was, as far as the church life goes, he was fairly still maintained the tradition, or Orthodox tradition as such. And the men with beards and stuff. You see the beards, and this is part of Orthodox cultural tradition that men wear beards. You go back to Apostolic Constitution, the man wears a beard, and hence why priests will wear beards. It's not just priests wearing beards; it's all men should wear beards. And so you see this in the Russian culture, and this gets really interesting when you see Peter the Great come along and how this and the old believers and how this becomes a whole point of tension. That's why I pointed this out. This is actually, you see, if you go through all the Eastern icons, you see the soldiers, everyone's wearing beards, basically, because that is Christian culture. And so you get, so he's sort of very following there. Now, but this authoritarian side thing, and you start seeing this both actually, so we're talking about the rule of law before, and that the churches will, what you do see is a shift both in Constantinople and in Russia with the Turkish influence over Ottomans or the Seljuks or the Mongols. Is a sort of more Eastern authoritarian ruler thing. I rule by dictate, and I am the boss. And so you start getting the sense of bishops start becoming rulers of the priests, and the bishops, whatever the bishop says is law, and the priests have to obey him. And the canons are less important. It's authority of the bishop, and it becomes more. And the other bishops, well, that's the bishop said that, we support him because he is a man of authority. So you get this, and then the bishops will start dressing up as emperors. So instead of wearing because in the 14th century is really important. It says it's necessary that the bishop takes off his episcopal insignia, the omniphorion. He didn't wear a mitre, and he didn't. If he sometimes wore a sarcos, but at this age, occasionally, but generally he still wore a florian, just like a priest does. He takes that off when he serves the liturgy. In other words, he serves the liturgy dressed in the same way as all the presbyters. He serves as a priest among priests. He is not something different. He doesn't wear other things. He serves liturgy as a priest amongst priests. There's nothing on him to show him as a bishop, except he's the one at the front end of the altar, because one has to offer. Only when he does an ordination does he put his omniphorion on back, and only when he communes does he put his omniphorion back on. He communes as first as a bishop, but he offers the liturgy as a priest. So what happens is you start getting all the bishops starting to wear episcopal, imperial thing. The sarcos from the emperor, the mitre comes from the emperor. These are imperial things, and they start behaving like emperors. And then they take off the big omniphorion to keep the tradition. Then they put on a little one. So they serve as something different from the priests. They dress differently, behave differently from the priests, other than some certain things like blessing of the candles, etc. But at the actual offering after the gospel, from the gospel onwards, they do the same. And so they start dressing. So you're getting this more of this autocratic sort of Eastern control thing, and which still happens to our relationships to bishops now. And it's particularly strong in Russia. This sort of centralized autocratic in the way the bishop relates to people, and the sort of top down, the priests come and serve me. And again, you get the priests bringing the vestments to the bishop. What is this? The subdeacons and the deacons dressed, or subdeacons dressed, but not the priest. The priest presumably walking in with the bits. That's actually dishonoring the equality of the priest. The priests vest themselves and stand beside. So if you go to right in Constantinople, outside when the bishop dresses, the priests also vest outside with him. They're all vesting together. He has the subdeacons and deacons helping him, but the presbyters are all vesting together. They all come in and wait and invest together. So you see this change in the church where he's the only one that's vesting. And now the Greek church, he stands in the bishop's and the emperor's throne, with the emperor's throne on the side. He's standing near as the bishop's throne. This is a collapse, almost a papal collapse of secular authority in church authority. So you get this happening, and this happens in Russia. It happens in the East as well, and this influence of Eastern influence, which we are continuing to have today, which explains a lot of the psychology Eastern, which when we come from a British culture where we're very much rule of law, and even this is actually true from Roman culture, we go, whoa, what is this? We find it a bit hard to take onto a board. And I don't think it's necessarily our problem. It's that autocratic influence. So anyway, you get this. So I don't know much more about Ivan apart from maybe this type of influence. Unless you've got something else you wanted to throw in there.
No, not really. I think it's just important in terms of the emerging statehood based in Moscow, which Peter,
So we go into Peter then.
Yeah, and I think we'll go into Peter, and I think we'll head towards the synodal period, because what I'd like to kind of answer is something I didn't research is when did Moscow adopt the title Third Rome for itself? But anyway, let's aim for the synodal.
The Third Rome comes just before this, so it's before Peter. This is more about Ivan time.
Right.
Now, should we just digress on this as far as I can?
Yeah.
So, in a sense, because the fall of the empire and a desire, in some ways, a good desire to continue the empire, Rome, the metropolitans of the bishop or the emperors of the leaders of Moscow were starting to think of themselves as sort of the new czars, and this is where you get the czars, the Caesar. They consider they model themselves on the Roman Caesars, and then they saw themselves as Caesars. They're carrying on the imperial Caesar, just like the Holy Roman Empire would basically call themselves Roman emperors. The Russians also decided that they would be a continuation of the Russian imperial thrones and stuff. And so then, in becoming a patriarch around that time, they saw themselves as the third Rome, the sort of continuation and development of the the first see. So when they came patriarch, they consider them almost like another Rome, and therefore to reinforce their patriarchal status and sort of almost like we are now the church in charge because the other Romes has fallen. This comes in as one of their sort of claims. Now, for myself, my opinion is that I can see why they're doing it, and I can see that there's a prophecy of St. John Chrysostom that the Antichrist will come after Rome falls, so it needs to be a sort of a continuation of Rome to the end before the Antichrist. So this is which I see in other ways. You can see it in the symbolism of the Russian Empire. You can see it in the symbolism of the Holy Roman Empire to a certain degree, the British Empire, and then nowadays the American Republic. It carries all the symbol of the eagles, the Senate, and all this. It's very Roman, and the Pax Americana was very much like Pax the Romana sort of thing. There's sort of parallels in what Chrysostom actually says is in the power which is sort of dominant in the world that actually prevents sort of chaos of all wars going out, even though there's lots of little wars, because it's so dominant, it manages to keep everybody else at a certain level of check from exploding too much. So, as a matter of fact, I think Chrysostom is correct, but we just see it in a symbolic way rather than that. So I can see Rome, but as I said, when it comes to the city of Rome, that has to be a continuation of the actual emperors of the Roman Empire. And also, when you start splitting more than a couple, the unity starts lost. But because they're outside, they're not part of the empire. There's no continuation. There's no political continuity of the empire with them. They're just sort of claiming it out of nothing. Then I say, no, they have no place to that because they have they're not proper political powers to do that.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's important. There was no continuity. It was just an assumption. That's an important characteristic about that so-called second Rome, third Rome thing. That wasn't a continuation.
Well, this is an interesting question. Why is it that bishops don't wear mitres in the East and they do in the Roman Catholic? I assume that they mean the double-headed mitre. Also Western development. I think it starts seen in 7th, 8th century when you start getting them, the two Gospels or the two Testaments that the bishops wear that. So that is much more of a symbolic meaning of their Christian teaching. So you do start seeing mitres coming in later on. They're not all over ubiquitous, I think is a correct word, until later. But the Eastern mitre is definitely a drawing of the imperial crown. And then it sort of has a religious meaning as well, which is sort of similar to some of the Western mitres. But yeah, no, that Western thing was definitely a custom, again, maybe a Frankish custom, Roman custom, where they started wearing that particular type, which never took off in the East. And generally, priests and bishops served bareheaded. And you'll see generally in the altar, especially with in Greek services, everyone serves bareheaded except the priest. You see Russians actually wear hats inside the altar. That you wouldn't get that in Greek churches. They'll still serve bareheaded. Greeks will put a hat on when they go outside of the altar, So when they go out to do petitions outside, they put a hat on. The deacons, and even the deacons, the same. So when I was serving as deacon of Mount Athos, I'll take my hat off every time I walk into the altar, put it back on when I go out to do the things, take it off. So I had to put it up on the things, run around catching hats. Whereas they'll wear them continuously in the Russian practice. So anyway, I don't know. I know that the Eastern mitre definitely comes out of the imperial thing. I don't know why they didn't pick up the mitre thing. Maybe it's just something that developed in the West as a particular habit. There might be more to it. That's as far as I'm aware.
Well, the Eastern crown is called a mitre anyway. So the word mitre is used for both of those things. I would imagine. So yeah. So I don't know. Thank you for the question, Katerina. That's a good question. I don't think I know the answer, but Father, you've kind of suggested why, and given some context about why there might be that difference in design.
Yeah. I think the Western one is more of a church-based development, whereas the Eastern one is drawing on the imperial crowns. They've appropriated it for Christian use and designed it for Christian in a Christian manner, but nevertheless, it's derived from the imperial crown as far as I can see, as distinct from purely church development.
Yeah. So thank you,
Katerina. So in this, so we've got in the 17th century, you've also got the Council 1666. Now, why I mention that is there's increasing influence of Jesuits in the Middle East, and that influence also started coming into Russia. And so in the 1620, they were still much more just an Eastern way of thinking in their church practice, etc., much more sort of strict Eastern way. But then there's this Jesuit influence that starts coming in 1666. And then what happens in 1700, you get Peter. Now, Peter is a great lover of the West. And so he actually reinforces or doubles down culturally on drawing on Western influence. He loves the Protestants of the West. He loves the Roman Catholics. So the architecture in Russia starts drawing on Italian, this is post-schism Italian architecture. And so they actually start modeling their architecture, their art, etc., is drawn on post-Renaissance Western stuff, which is a different mentality, is coming out of a different source. And then he's trying to make men look more like Western people, so he's shaving their beards and making. So he's heavily Western influenced. And then even worse is he starts effectively making the church a department of state. So this is where church-state relations going on. And so he's destroying the proper balance. He's making the church a department of state. He's modeling more like in the British system. And by seizing the Protestant systems is that they're following there. And he removes the patriarch and it starts interfering with that. And you see increasingly from there. And then Catherine the Great doubles down on that, and she reinforces so that the whole way of music, the whole 19th century, all the 4-part harmony music. This is all Western influence. This is all coming out of basically the Renaissance development, or what I would say corruption and secularization of church life in the West. Peter basically incorporates it into the Russian church, and so you see this in their way of icons, etc. And their way of behavior becomes more autocratic, more authoritarian, more state-orientated. Then you have the non-possessors and the possessors controversy, because you're getting this overstate control in the church. Therefore, it's putting this controversy forward, which doesn't happen. And the Roman Empire, the Christian Roman Empire of the East, it's not a tension, but it becomes a tension because you're starting to get this tension of state and this freedom, from state starts coming through the Russian.
I think I should put some dates on it. Like Peter was ruling 1683, 1725, and the synodal period. I just did my research just now, 1721 to until the Bolsheviks. So, so should it? I'm trying to now understand how did the Europeans manage to alter the structure of the church in Russia. So they so was it a combination, Father, of European influence with despotic authority of the Tsar at the time?
Yeah, I think I don't think that I'm not sure of what pressure or proactive influence that the West may have had in Russia in itself. Now, the papacy did want and has always wanted to bring Russia under the papal control. You've got this constant tension within the Belarus, Ukraine, between the Uniates and been trying to drag them in and keep them in their ways, and then influence pushing back and forward, and who's got political power in this. So you've got this all the way along the western border of Russia through Ukraine, Belarus, up into the actually up in that stuff, you have much more Protestant influence, Germanic Protestant influence up there. So you've got this sort of tensions on the borders. So you've got this influence or pressure coming on there. But I think it's Peter just fell in love with the West. I mean, you've already got this Jesuit influence, and then he just starts drawing a Western thought. So they're starting to teach in Latin. They're starting to use Latin style catechisms and theology and things like this. So I think it's Emperor down, which really is starting to push it. So it's the Emperor.
Let's look. Yeah, let's look at a detail. Sorry to interrupt you, Father. Let's look at a detail there, and just for the internet, just explain the synodal period was when there was going to be no patriarch by imperial decree, and that the Tsar was going to have his his representative as the boss of the synod of the church, and that was the administration of power within the church. And this is that synodal period that we were talking about. So if we drill down into this, one of the criticisms I've seen is to kind of excuse it away and say, yeah, even though it was the church in Russia was administered synodally under the auspices as a department of the Russian state, didn't matter. It was fine. They didn't do anything wrong. But I've seen that. I don't know how good that is as an explaining away.
Well, one of the dangers from this is going on. Yeah, it's a good question. One of the dangers is, of course, what happened to the priesthood is becoming like the Armenians or like the Jewish priesthood, which was becoming a family. You had priestly families. So you had the state caste families there, and the priest becoming this father to son and passed on. You had to be a son of the priest to be a priest. This is actually a heresy. The priesthood must not be family. So they didn't quite go to the stage where it was formalized as their doctrine and practice, but it became almost de facto their practice. And so you've got this thing which is not according to the tradition of the church. So this is one of the things that's where the state is starting to take control of the church. And these are, so there's influence of architecture, there's influence on the art, there's influence on the singing, the form, the dress. Like the bishops suddenly told all presbyters to put on crosses because the emperor tried to confess to a deacon or something. So this is not the tradition of the church. Only abbots and bishops would wear such a thing. But they're all presbyters. This is where the Russians all wear their crosses, and which is the Greeks looking, well, what are you doing? That is because of the imperial influence. Again, now that's not necessarily wrong, but it's just these little things that are influenced through there. But the art, music, architecture, these are not good things. These are things that are moving away from the tradition of the church. And so, and then the way the priesthood was, that was within the tradition of the church. The canons speak against that sort of thing. So you get this quite a heavy influence of Western things. Their relationship to Roman Catholics is also influenced by that. The reception of Roman Catholics, so they invent these new ways of vesting them. I've never heard of that. No one has ever heard of that. It's a new thing. Now that it's to do with the uniates and stuff, and there's reasons for it. It's not just absolutely just brought in for no reason. There is a particular thing, but these are sort of little innovations and things that are happening in Russia. Now, where there's the grace of the Holy Spirit, was it? Yes, we continue despite all these things, because if you go back to Western Europe, there were many problems in the church practice from 7th, 8th century, which eventually got so bad that they're forced to have to break off from the church. Russia is sort of heading in that way, but it's not got so bad that we deny that there's the grace of the church there. The church is quite robust in a sense and can handle this. So it wasn't good that there was no patriarch and this control by everything. That was definitely not good. But it didn't actually destroy the church as being the Church of Christ in that land. But it was certainly a corruption. And I think this is ultimately why you've got communism comes in and the revolution, because the church had effectively become so corrupt in the tradition and holding the tradition. In some things, it was very good. In some aspects, it was very good. But it had got so heavily influenced that it needed to come to a crushing end. Unfortunately, the church coming out of communism has, to a little degree, repented for some of these things. But in many things, it's just picked up where it was and carried on, sadly. And you can see this now in a growing tension with Constantinople and the Eastern churches, that it's again sort of closing on the state and it's tied with the state authorities, etc. It's not quite the same as it was before. It's keeping the separation of church and state now, but there's a tendency pulling back towards that, and its relations to the world becoming more independent. We do what we want. We have a Church of Russia. We've got the right to judge the Patriarch Alexander is a schismatic, so we all go and put our churches and bishops in there to look after the people. What is this? This is this type of mentality which is strange. So unfortunately, and this is eventually going to end up with a full-on schism. Thankfully, Antioch is binding the Greek speakers and the things. Antioch is sort of, and Serbia are sort of keeping the union together just. But it's definitely a great problem. But anyway, it all goes back, and I'll just
So, Father, I'll just speculate a bit, and you can tell me what you think about this random speculation that's just occurred to me, which was that if the inception of this synodal period, 721. Would have been quite different in character, and by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, because I think that if the Russian state was pretty much very European, that would mean that the bureaucratization of the state would be less monarchical and increasingly more civil administration. So the sidelining and the diminution of royal prerogatives and the increasing rise of non-royal influence in government and in the administration of government in the state. So I guess what I'm saying, this is my speculation, do you think, okay, early 18th century synodal period, church is functioning with this imposition of a representation of the Tsar in those synods, but throughout the 19th century, with all of those the political scene in the 19th century in Europe, the diminution of monarchical influence and the rise of, I guess they'll call it democratic forms of governance taking over, because I mean, doesn't this describe what Tsar Nicholas II was kind of facing and what he ended up?
Yeah, you've got the bureaucracy too, which is interesting. I think we talk about democracy and monarchy, but one of the biggest issues coming up is the the size of the state bureaucracy. So, the monarch, all the time we think about the monarchy was with a few advisors, a few ministers, etc. And they didn't go, they had a certain absolute authority, but in a sense, their power didn't go very deep into the state because they didn't have the functions, they didn't have the structures to impose their power very deeply into it. And so you have a lot more autonomy in the regions and stuff, and the governors, etc. Whereas in the 19th century, you're getting an increasing bureaucracy of the state. And this bureaucracy actually allows the emperor to put himself, but it also gets so welded that it gets its own beast in that sense, and it becomes harder to. Then you've got the pressures of the democratic things, or the parliaments on top as well. So the people are getting fed by this. So anyway.
Yeah, Father, do you think democratic is the right word, or oligarchic? Because if those institutions of government were being taken over at that civil level of administration by dynastic family lines, both in the military and throughout government, maybe oligarchic is a kind of, democracy, oligarchy in pseudo democracy or something. So perhaps democracy was the wrong word.
Well, yeah, there's quite a class structure with serfs and stuff. So it was they had their princes class, etc. Well, you get communism coming in more than sort of American democracy was a heavy influence on Russia. So the question was a communist revolution. Were sort of a party, but a single party sort of state where you have sort of voting and a destruction of the hierarchical structures, which are not necessarily bad in themselves. So yeah, there's all these questions. Obviously, Tsar Nicholas is struggling, but their particular problem was communism, and you see this in Dostoevsky when he talks about all his communist opinions and stuff appearing in his day, etc. So I think there's a bureaucracy was growing as well. So the church was becoming more bureaucratic, the whole and when you got bureaucracy, you sort of more this priestly class and stuff. Everybody is ticking boxes and following this. This is a sort of a sign of bureaucracy as well. So yeah, but a lot of people know a lot better on exact influences and stuff. But certainly their problem was certainly the communist ideology coming in and a sort of a revolt against the whole aristocracy and the emperor and a humanistic type of thought, which obviously really harmed Russia in a deep way through the time of communism.
Yeah, let's answer Katerina's question and then come back to it. So at the end of Katerina's statement, she's asking, in the Antiochian Church in the UK, do the priests have permission to wear crosses?
I don't know. I've never asked about. Now, I know the story there why the priests have to as a Roman. Now, what happens is, of course, the Russian priests do that. A lot of in the UK, and because the Russian priests are doing that, a lot of priests influenced do the same thinking, not actually having the discretion to know what is Greek practice, what is Antiochian practice, or things. They just see priests doing it, so they just pick up and start wearing a cross in this like manner, not understanding that these things have their own political, cultural heritage and stuff, and what is right and stuff. You see a lot of Antiochian churches and convert Anglican parishes, so they'll start doing Russian music, etc. They have no concept that this is particularly Russian thing, is not Orthodox. They just assume it's all Orthodox, and they start introducing. So you get bishops turning up, and they're going, "What on earth is the people doing?" but it's so embedded that it gets very hard for the bishop to do anything about it. So I think the bigger problem is outside the Middle East. Antiochians are so heavily watching what the Russians are doing; they're just copying it without actually and knowing what the meaning is and what the context. So they're just doing it and without any permission per se. And if there's permission later, it's almost the bishop's hands twisted behind his back. He's got no choice but to allow it to continue. So that would be my best understanding of that, having not actually got any particular understanding of what is permitted or not permitted.
I was getting a bit philosophical as I was trying to just use my
Obviously,
imagination.
Katharina is just saying that they have permission. So obviously, the bishop
Yeah.
feels like it's okay to do.
So if Peter was trying to Europeanize his uh, his state, well, already we know what that European attitude was to its own Catholic and Protestant churches. So if was Peter adopting those uh, anti-clerical attitudes or pro-clerical attitudes of the Romans and Protestants of Europe towards his own domestic church, so-called domestic church? Because if that's true, we would have to see evidence and examples of the effect of those things. So, like, I guess I don't know if the priests were salaried in Russia at this stage or not, but if it was a department of the government, I'd imagine that they were government and civil servants, more or less. I don't know. So,
Yeah, I'm not sure of the details. I'm sure there are effects on the way Russian Christianity developed. There certainly are effects, as I said, in church, music, architecture, and things like this.
but the effect would be a European effect on the Russian church, and I'd
The
start
drawing
be
on, yes,
looking.
so these things are all copied from the Western Europeans as sort of Renaissance style effect of things, and so Peter's introducing these into and almost imposing them on the church. So that's why you get old believers are partly their revolt against some of this, because they go, "Whoa, well, what's this innovation?" Now, partly it's the old believers is partly more the 17th century looking towards the practice of Constantinople and trying to update their books called the Greek liturgical books. So this is probably the bigger driver. But there's also this whole cultural thing of beards and stuff and the persecutions that come by and the old believers. So there's a double strand thing that starts going through into the 18th century and stuff into this debates that are going on. But yeah, I don't know. All I know is that all I can say is that the influence wasn't so bad that the other Orthodox churches of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch deemed it necessary to separate from Russia. There was some people visited and got a bit scandalized, but they were just told this it's okay. That's what they do. So there's a continuing relation when they weren't cut off for it. So it wasn't so bad as to destroy the churches there as Orthodox churches. And in some ways, the Russians were still kept a certain rigor about their Orthodoxy. But I'm wondering whether it's more about their Russian Orthodox, being Russian, part of their cultural thing as against the West, where they wanted to keep their distinction, or whether it was Orthodoxy in its pure apostolic tradition sense.
So I'm kind of reviewing or reconsidering my understanding of the old believers as kind of an abreaction to this European influence, but also the possessors, non-possessors, Neil Sorsky, and the position of Joseph Wolokomonsk as property, ownership of property, and what that means in this kind of emerging modern state by clergy, or by church institutions. So these are both crises, you know. So those two crises must have been a manifestation of this pressure from European.
Look, I hadn't thought about it in this context, but I'm sure at least that this influence was exasperated this crisis. So because you've still got the possessors and non-possessors and the whole issue. In some ways, you can see even the Roman Empire, but why doesn't it come out as an issue? Whether your church can possess property or not. So it seems strange that in the 1,000 years before that this didn't sort of manifest itself clearly as an issue in the empire.
State violence would be a factor why it came out. So the imposition of force by the states.
Yes, so it's therefore that something's happened in the Russian state-church relations where this becomes a problem. and so it's something to do with that. And so this reinforced. I hadn't thought through. I knew that there was the issue there, but the whole reason behind it. So I think there is a good case to be made, though I would need to do a whole lot of deeper study, but that this is an influence, and this is one of the manifestations of that state church has been out of balance, not properly set.
Yeah. So it occurs to me there's a third factor as well, which is that starstvo, the spiritual elder thing, which it was also another kind of bifurcation of church life, which I think is a really good example of the spiritual, the Holy Spirit in the tradition of starstvo, and spiritual elders, allowing the church to thrive in a natural church, a good noetic way. Sorry, I don't know what I want to say about it, but it just occurs to me as a third phenomenon that demonstrates this pressure between church administration and the spiritual life of the church.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that now obviously you get your monastic elders in the Athenite tradition, but I'm wondering whether this is just an interesting point where there is a growing tension with. Which is one thing I found is, to me, your spiritual father of first port of call is your local presbyter. The presbyter is the central spiritual father, your confessor. So the distinction between the confessor or an elder than your local presbyter is for me, it's not very strong. You would go to a monastic elder if you're a monk, or perhaps the presbyter is lacking the full depth of his own spiritual life. If you advance and you go on, but there's not a sort of clash between this sort of robotic, just a total a stereotype, but just a swinging sense of priest who's just a sort of functionary and there, but with sort of little or no spiritual capacity, just does his job in there as a functionary. And the person who's actually got the spiritual life is the elder out there. So you go to your elder for your counsel and your spiritual father. So you're sort of pulling that apart because the priest has sort of become almost a state functionary and he's losing his spiritual position amongst his flock. And so this may be part of what builds this sort of tension and sort of over-exaggeration of this, which is interesting, has an influence on Orthodox life now, where I think there's sort of almost some influence of guru type of spiritual elders, which comes from this. So you've got the spiritual, and you go to him as like a guru who can tell you all your things. I think that this is not the best way. For me, the press, we talked about this before, I'm here to teach the traditions of the church so the people are guided directly to Christ. It's not that I have any great spiritual insights or I can order people around and tiny details in their lives. That's not my job. My job is there to teach them the traditions of the church. What's the gospel say? How to there, and that's. But in that there is a grace, of course, as a presbyter, when you do that and to help the discernment, etc., to work with the person. So there's a spirituality within this tradition. But it's not. It's like a guru where I sort of got some great insight, and I think this is dangerous when you start getting towards that, and especially when priests start thinking that their priesthood is about being a guru to other people. So you start confusing this. Oh, I'm the guru to you. All spiritual fellowship is this great sort of spiritual thing, and that can be really dangerous and set quite dangerous relationships between people. And a dangerous attitude towards people, towards the presbyter, where it becomes too much. Just do as he said. Sort of order this. I must get a blessing to blow my nose, sort of thing. It just becomes sort of twisted up. I don't know, but I'm just thinking this could be part of the influence of that.
Yeah. Third row. Oh, so we'll address this question of Katerina, but then I think, Father, with your permission, we'll start to wind up.
Yes,
Coming to the Bolshevik period. Yeah. So what does she say? The size. What does this all mean? Yeah. So I think, Father, you kind of answered this. Being the Third Rome being kind of an assumed mantle, given the collapse of the Hellenic, the Roman Empire under the Turks. So it seems like there was no continuation of the handing on of the title of Rome, 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 first, second, third, one Rome. It just seems like pretty much an assumed label. So
and yes, and interesting. Even if it was a third Rome, if it was possible, it doesn't displace. There's not a passing on from one to the other. Rome maintains its position. The other one shares in that position. The other one shares it. We're always recognizing the prior one as prior to it and a first to it. It's never to replace it or take over it and diminish it. It's always there. Now, the church never recognized this third Rome, because if it did, it would have raised it up to actually equal to Constantinople, but it didn't put it below the other ones. So this was something that Russia sort of saw the fall. They sort of, we want to keep the imperial thing going. We are the great peril. We will keep this. Therefore, our see will become the next Rome and take all the privileges of this. This is a sort of self-imposed, aggrandizement stuff for a reason, in the similar way that the papacy, when it made Charlemagne, had a reason for that, which is not in itself necessarily wrong, but it distorted and twisted things as sort of an innovation. So that's my particular understanding. Russia tried to keep something on, but it really just made an innovation which isn't justified by the traditions of the church.
So further, I think we've answered or addressed the first Rome, second Rome, third Rome thing. And I think this is a good place to stop historically with the advent of the Bolsheviks. And so we won't talk about the communist period in Russia. We won't talk about the post-communist period in Russia. We won't talk about the 20th century diaspora throughout the world so because they're all topics in their own right. And I'd recommend Father Peter Hare's the Catechism Church. He's done a great video presentation on that topic there. So so unless there's anything you comes to your mind that you wish you
no, I think that's a good place to call it quits, and I think it's now midnight.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Father, for a beautiful and very enjoyable conversation. Very thorough. That was very thought-provoking for me. And
yes, well, I just say this is how, as I understand your traditions. I may be wrong. Some of this is how I sort of see the history as such. So someone might come along and say, "Oh no, this is not quite well." I'm happy to sort of adapt, but I think these sort of fit the general pattern of things as I've seen them develop through time, and and it seems to gel with the constant tradition of the church.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Father. I hope you have a good rest. And hope you have a good fast and a good
thank you as well, and a good feast to come. If we don't talk before Christmas, but if you wish to have another talk before, happy to.
Thank you, Father.
Come and join you. Yeah. All right, your prayers and your bless.
Amen. Your blessing, Father.
Of the Lord. Lord. All right. Bye bye for now.